Hello again, Justin Bishop here. So if you have listened to our most recent episode on Once Upon a Time in China, then you know that we have just announced our next long-form series. Up next, we're going to be spending about 7 episodes covering the career of David Fincher, the director behind films such as Fight Club, Seven, and The Social Network. But of course, he began his career with the ill-fated Alien 3. Now, there is a lot of backstory for Alien 3, as it was a movie that was in development hell for years before Fincher ever came on board. It's a film that went through multiple concepts, multiple writers, multiple directors, all of which, of course, we will be covering in our next episode. But a lot of the backstory for Alien 3 is directly related to the first 2 films in the Alien franchise, especially since Walter Hill and his co-producers at Brandywine Productions have been the caretakers of the Alien property ever since Walter Hill was hired to work on the original film. So we're going to give you a little Cinema Shock Rewind episode and republish our episode on Alien, the original Alien, which was originally released back in April of 2021 as part of a series on the career of Dan O'Bannon. Now, at the time, we were naively trying to keep our episodes a little bit shorter. We quickly learned that wasn't ever going to be possible, but at the time, we thought we could, so we opted to cut the story of Alien into 2 episodes. It was actually released as Alien Episode 1 and Alien Episode 2, both covering one film. So for this Cinema Shock Rewind release, we've decided to stitch those 2 episodes together into a single, very long episode, which gets into all the nitty-gritty details about the production of that film. So whether you're a longtime listener who just wants a refresher on the story of Alien's production, or you're a new listener who didn't hear it at the time that it was released, we're giving you the full story here on Ridley Scott's Alien, and I really do think that hearing this story will enhance your enjoyment of our upcoming Alien 3 episode. And no, before you ask, we did not forget about Mr. Cameron. We will be releasing a rewind of our coverage on the second film in the franchise, Aliens, in just a few more days, or, you can just scroll back real far on your podcast feed and find it. Either way, we highly recommend checking it out. So that's enough yapping from me. Without further ado, here's our throwback episode on Ridley Scott's Alien.
How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I'm Gary Horne.
Hey, I'm Justin Bishop, and we're joined today by our best friend, Mr. Todd A. Davis.
Hey, guys.
Hey,
Thanks for having me.
I don't know why I felt like introducing you that way.
Our hetero life mate, Todd A. Davis.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, man, guys, strap it in. Strap it in? Is that the way that phrase goes?
I don't know what you were going for, honestly.
It's strap it on.
Strap it on, guys. We're in for the long run on this one. We're talking about one of the biggest movies we've ever talked about. This is on up there with maybe Night of the Living Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre as one of the most iconic films that we've talked about on the show so far.
Oh, yeah.
For part 2.
We're pegging those ear holes today, baby.
That's right. Our series on Dan O'Bannon, which I have renamed, by the way, is no longer Hollywood's Secret Weapon because I felt like that was an inappropriate title. It never really sat well with me because here's the thing. He would be considered Hollywood's secret weapon if Hollywood, were properly using his talents, right? He was like the guy they brought in, but he's the guy that they kind of ignored. Dan O'Bannon was. He never really got his due, which is why we're trying to give him his due. So I've renamed the series The Unsung Legacy of Dan O'Bannon. I think that's a little more accurate, don't you?
Yeah, and it's a little more poetic. I like it.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, I like it too.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate your approval. But
Todd's
approval is more important.
Well,
let's be honest. Todd's approval has never been important here.
that is a bummer.
Todd, you're an important aspect of this show,
Aww.
whether you believe it or not.
That's sweet of you to say. Thank you.
Otherwise, it's just me and Gary being nerds the whole time. Talking, but we need someone to bounce off of, someone that's going to challenge our views sometime. Someone.
Okay, I'll be that guy.
All right, so let's get into it, guys. So last week we talked about Dark Star, John Carpenter's debut film, also Dan O'Bannon's debut film. So during the filming of that film, of Dark Star, before their partnership had been disbanded, as we discussed in detail last week, Dan O'Bannon and John Carpenter actually talked about making a similar sci-fi film, a story set within a spaceship where a crew discovers an alien threat, inspired just like kind of like Dark Star was by The Thing from Another World, a film that they both loved growing up. And it was, as Dan O'Bannon described this project, as they kind of discussed it, he said it was like the same story, but in a different light. It was a similar concept, but he wanted to make people scared instead of make people laugh. And O'Bannon actually worked on it. He wrote the first act of the screenplay, and the plan was that this time O'Bannon would be the director. Of course, none of this happened after they essentially the band broke up. the Carpenter O'Bannon band broke up, and Carpenter actually said, "Hey, you just take this," you know. But that half-finished screenplay kind of stuck. O'Bannon kind of held on to it, you know, and it's one that he would later rework with a writer named Ron Shusett, and went through several iterations and had multiple titles along the way. But when it was finally completed and released in 1979, it would be known as simply Alien.
Some of you may have figured out we're not home yet. We're only halfway there. Mother's intercepted a transmission of unknown origin. You got us up to check it out.
Human.
Unknown.
Phoenix movement.
What happened to Kane?
Something has attached itself to him. We have to get him to the infirmary right away. What the hell is that? Oh, we gotta get it off him.
Got a wonderful defense mechanism. You don't dare kill it.
It's gotta be a way of killing it.
Still don't understand what you're dealing with, doing. Perfect. Well goes.
Get out of the way!
There's no fun story that I could find, and maybe you did different, on why it suddenly was called Alien instead of Star Beast, which I know you're going to bring up. Just so as we get to that, people know. It just seems like he just saw Alien a bunch in his script from everything I could find.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah,
they were looking at the script, and first of all, Star Beast is a dumb name. It sounds like a Roger Corman movie, which this almost was.
Yeah, I was just kind of,
but
some sort of offshoot of D&D or something.
Yeah, but yeah, basically O'Bannon they were going over their screenplay and just kept seeing the word alien, alien, alien. So they're like, hey, this is a noun and it's an adjective, you know, somehow no movie had ever been called just Alien. So that's where it came from. And so O'Bannon had never really been thrilled with that beach ball alien from Dark Star, even though, you know, it was funny. It was a funny gag. That's why they put it in the film to begin with, because they saw somebody walking with a beach ball, and the idea of that being the alien made them laugh. But the experience really left him with wanting to do an alien that looked real. So meanwhile, around the same time, Ronald Shusett, who was a fellow burgeoning screenwriter, he was working on a project of his own. He had optioned a Philip K. Dick short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, a story that became the basis for a film that would eventually be released as Total Recall about a decade and a half later. So Shusett he had actually seen Dark Star. And I think Shusett was a student at UCLA. He wasn't at USC, but he was a film student at UCLA, I believe. But he had seen Dark Star and he had been impressed with it. So he contacted O'Bannon, hoping that the two of them could one day collaborate. And they started talking in between the two projects, between, you know, O'Bannon's Alien, you know, killer alien screenplay and the Total Recall screenplay. They eventually chose to work on O'Bannon's idea because they thought it would be cheaper and easier to produce.
Get that low hanging fruit while you can.
So at that point, O'Bannon had about 29 pages of screenplay written. And it was actually called Memory at the time, which I don't know why it was called Memory. I could not find any information on what that word had to do with the screenplay.
Maybe because it goes back to his father taking Polaroids in the woods
maybe,
of ETs.
Maybe. But those 29 pages contained what would eventually become the opening scenes of Alien. You had a crew of astronauts that were awakened from cryosleep to find out that their voyage had been interrupted because they'd received a signal from a nearby mysterious planetoid. So they investigate, and when they go down to the surface, their ship breaks down, and that was kind of the extent of it. He didn't really have a clear idea of who or what the actual alien threat was going to be at this point. But before he could really flesh this idea out any further, O'Bannon accepted the offer to go work on Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune, which is a project that would take him to Paris for 6 months. We discussed that a little bit last week.
Yeah.
And as we discussed last week, that project eventually fell through, but it did introduce O'Bannon to several artists who would influence his later work, namely Chris Foss, Jean Girard, aka Mobius, and most notably probably as H.R. Giger.
Yeah, as tough a experience as that probably was for him, it probably made up for it on the back end just with all the networking.
Oh yeah, I mean he would work with several of these artists again over the course of his career. So H.R. Giger, a little bit of background on this guy if you're not aware.
He likes penises.
He does. He does not like snakes and does not like worms, though. Is terrified of them. He is. He talks about it in interviews. It's very weird because he's this scary looking dude. Looks like a fucking vampire. But he talks about like worms. Just he's got like a intense fear of them. I
remember I was watching one of the commentaries. John Hurt talks about seeing him. He's very goth. Who's like, just even at the time, like he's, this is more accepted now, but at the time it was really weird. He was like, he never knew anybody except for like one other person. And then he met Giger and his girlfriend that were always wearing as much black as possible at all times. Very pale skin, kind of like almost like dark rings around his eyes. Like he's part of the Addams family or something. So H.R. Giger was born in Chur, Switzerland in 1940. And he used those early phobias of snakes and worms actually as inspiration for his artwork. So even when he was a young, like up and coming artist, he was using the idea of fear as an inspiration for art. And he moved to Zurich in 1962 and he went to school there. He studied architecture and industrial design. But by 1964, he was creating his first like artwork, his first paintings, sculptures, things like that. They were mostly ink drawings and oil paintings at the time. And that quickly led to a solo show. He had his first solo show in 1966. But a little while after that, he discovered the airbrush. And along with it, he kind of discovered his own unique freehand painting style, creating these dark, disturbing, and often highly sexualized biomechanical landscapes that he would become known for. Then after his longtime girlfriend, after she died by suicide in 1975, his work took an even darker turn. He had these grotesque monsters with skeletal bodies, giant phallic heads, and he often rendered them in monochromatic colors, lots of grays and blacks, very little, if any, color in any of Giger's work. Over the course of his career, Giger published more than 20 books of artwork. He created sculptures. He designed an entire bar. There's a place called the Giger Bar in Tokyo, and opened his own museum in the late 90s. This was fascinating. Go look at pictures of it. But he opened his own museum, I think about 1998. It was housed inside of a castle in the medieval city of Gruyere, Switzerland. So he bought an old medieval castle and turned it into the Giger Museum. Of course he did.
Yeah. And probably his most famous book was published in 1977. It's called Necronomicon, and it was that book that served as the main inspiration for his eventual work on Alien.
You hear, the background of what influenced his art. I kind of wish he'd gotten more into, I know he did some work in the comics industry, but I really wish he'd gotten hooked up with a couple of other writers like,
yeah, he doesn't seem like the type to do that type of creative work, like storytelling work.
Yeah,
to me, he just seems like he wants to create images that invoke feelings.
Yeah,
in people.
Yeah, he's all about the atmosphere and that kind of thing.
Yeah, although it would have been really cool to see him work with like James O'Barr, Steve Niles. Some of those guys.
I bet comics couldn't afford him either. because
you're probably right.
he seems to know his worth, and
he also worked at very large scale because he's
wow.
airbrushing most of the time.
Oh, that's cool.
So the way Dan O'Bannon put it, he said, his paintings had a profound effect on me. I'd never seen anything that was quite as horrible and at the same time as beautiful as his work. And so I ended up writing a script about a Giger monster.
Nice.
He was fascinated by Giger's work. And after meeting him, he found that the two of them, they shared a mutual appreciation for H.P. Lovecraft. Like O'Bannon, much like John Carpenter, grew up loving and idolizing H.P. Lovecraft. They both had this, and same with Giger, they both had this fascination with kind of fear of the unknown, which is a staple in Lovecraft's work.
Yeah, and I even read in some places from O'Bannon that they had the idea with I don't know why I can't talk, but like Cthulhu being a big source too, because they like the idea of this thing that's like trapped and like just waiting to be unleashed. And so the alien kind of got some inspiration from that just not necessarily the look of Cthulhu, but just Cthulhu's story as he's submerged at the bottom of the sea and you never see him. But if he ever escapes, then that's like the dread of mankind. Yeah, you're fucked if he gets out.
Giger's designs for Dune are incredible. You can find a lot of them available online, or watch, like I mentioned last week, watch the film Jodorowsky's Dune. But his brilliant designs couldn't save that movie. Nobody wanted to fund it. So after Dune collapsed, O'Bannon was left homeless and broke and ended up having to couch surf to survive. And eventually he ended up on the couch of his old friend, Ronald Shusett. And the two decided to revive that memory script that he'd been working on a couple years earlier. And O'Bannon had been stuck on the script. Like we said, he had written about 29 pages, but he couldn't get past that. So he asked Shusett to take a look at it. And the two eventually, it became a collaboration. They reworked it a little bit and they retitled the project Star Beast, and then began to shop it around without much luck at all at first. And O'Bannon would eventually take this early version of the script to Roger Corman. Corman thought the script was good. He liked it, but he told O'Bannon, he's like, this is going to require a much bigger budget than I can give you. I'm Roger Corman. do you know how I work? So he suggested that O'Bannon shop it around to other bigger studios because he thought it really had potential. And he wanted to see if he's like, hey, if you can't get another studio to give you a big budget for it, come back to me. We'll see what we can do and see if we can work on the kind of budget that I would be able to give.
Although I am morbidly curious to see what a Roger Corman alien would look like.
Oh, there are alien ripoffs that are produced by Roger Corman. They're out there.
Nice.
So, Roger Corman really liked to let's say riff on popular movies.
Okay.
And Alien is no exception.
Nice.
So none of the studios that they shopped this around to, they couldn't really figure out how to do the special effects for the film. That was something they couldn't really get their heads around. So O'Bannon, he went back to a second script that he'd been working on. This one was about a parasite in space, another sci-fi script, but a parasite in space that would attach itself to a crew member of the spaceship, and which, if you've seen Alien, sounds pretty familiar. So he combined elements of these two scripts and reconceptualized the monster from this kind of bizarrely shaped arachnid, like spider-like monster, to a more human-shaped monster, because he's like, then we can get a guy in a rubber suit.
Makes sense.
You should have learned on Dark Star that wasn't necessarily the best direction to go in if you're just looking for a guy in a rubber suit. It can go wrong.
Yeah.
But then O'Bannon got sidetracked from this project once again. This time it was because he received a phone call from none other than George Lucas. So Lucas, just like Jodorowsky, had been impressed with O'Bannon's work on Dark Star, and he invited him to help out on a little sci-fi movie he was working on called Star Wars.
Have we seen Star Wars? Have you guys seen Star Wars?
I've heard of it.
Okay. All right.
I think we'll cover it at some point.
Okay.
Probably watch it. It's a lesser known one.
So for the next 3 months, O'Bannon designed some of the animation on the movie, a sort of crude early form of computer generated special effects that included the display that like shows how the torpedoes are able to enter the Death Star, that scene on the screen. That was Dan O'Bannon. I mean, and this was playing on the kind of effects that, I think Gary talked about it a little bit last week, that he had done on Dark Star that had been so innovative. And it was cool. I mean, he got to work on Star Wars. So when we say the unsung legacy of Dan O'Bannon, like so far, Alien hasn't even been made yet. And he's already worked with John Carpenter, Alejandro Jodorowsky, and George Lucas on Star Wars.
Nice.
The dude had his hands in a lot of huge projects. You'd think he would be a household name, but he's not. And part of it's because he's, he kind of got fucked over. And part of it's because he's kind of difficult to work with, as we will get into.
Yeah, that conversation he had with John Carpenter seemed like enough to get him put on a couple lists.
Yeah,
taken off of lists.
Well, whereas John Carpenter, even though he can seem like a difficult person, he knows how to play the politics. And Dan O'Bannon had never had any interest in playing the politics of Hollywood. So this work on Star Wars, it paid the bills. He got a job for 3 months. It paid the bills, but it didn't exactly have like Hollywood knocking down his door to give him more work. So I'm going to take a little side note on this because I want to take a minute to retrace just where O'Bannon is at this time. So he'd made Dark Star. That was a film that he had hoped would launch his career, but like we discussed last week, it opened to little to no fanfare. It closed as quickly as it opened. And then he spent months in Paris working on Dune, only for that to fail as well. But then he notices how his old collaborator, John Carpenter, had started to become recognized as a hot up-and-coming director, even before Halloween. His follow-up to Dark Star, Assault on Precinct 13, had opened at the Cannes Film Festival and was a pretty decent hit. So it made John Carpenter kind of a director to watch. And O'Bannon would later say, he said, there's a quote from him, Carpenter would call me up and got a big boost over rubbing it in my face, and he threw me overboard, and he was doing just fine. It was sheer cruelty. So there's kind of a weird thing between them. There's a rivalry between them. And at this point, John Carpenter's winning, honestly, because he's at least had some success. And O'Bannon, by the way, did begrudgingly go to the Assault on Precinct 13 premiere because John Carpenter invited him, probably maybe to rub it in his face, or maybe this is all just O'Bannon projecting because this is from his point
I was about to say, it's possible that John Carpenter was being a douche, but it's also very possible that Dan O'Bannon just, like you said, is projecting. Like he seems to have a hate on for most people.
Yes, he does. But he went to it and he hated Assault on Precinct 13. He just thought that John Carpenter he thought it was mean spirited. And he was like, he said John Carpenter just seemed to not like people in his movies because they were treated so cruelly in his movies.
Well, it's just so funny because of last week and this week. I mean, I feel like we find Dan O'Bannon doesn't seem to like people very much. So
it doesn't seem to like most people, for sure.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me that these are like, I don't know, these are his things.
I think they're both kind of grumpy dudes. And
but at some point, it's not everybody else, it's you.
Yes, exactly. If there is a common denominator in all of the issues that you have with everyone, and that common denominator is you.
Yeah.
So at the same time all this is happening, he was suffering from an awful wrenching pain just below his navel. Because we discussed this a little bit last week during the filming of Dark Star. He was hospitalized and misdiagnosed with appendicitis, but even removing his appendix didn't help. And it wasn't correctly diagnosed as Crohn's disease until 1980. But he'd already spent years being tormented by the illness, which, if you know anything about Crohn's disease, it completely disrupts the normal process of digestion. It just leaves you in immense pain. So the simple act of eating terrified him because just eating could bring on this incredible pain in his stomach, which, I mean, you can't blame him for kind of being grumpy all the time when you're in pain that much, because there is no cure for Crohn's disease either. You can do things to alleviate some of the symptoms, changing your diet, but there's no cure for it. You live with it for the rest of your life. So he couldn't eat without it like hurting. A simple trip to the bathroom for him could potentially mean hours of pain, not to mention the humiliation of it, the mental strain on you. And this whole thing, it made him very nervous about traveling or even being far away from a bathroom, which makes it very hard when you're a filmmaker who, needs to travel for work. And stress made his condition worse. So the pain in his stomach was always on his mind. Oof. But what he didn't realize is that it would eventually serve as the inspiration for one of the best ideas that Dan O'Bannon ever had for a movie. So
I think I can see where we're going with that.
Yeah, it's that scene in Dumb and Dumber.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Another wonderful contribution by Dan O'Bannon to the world of cinema. He is actually the pseudonym of Peter Farrelly.
There you go.
So Shusett and O'Bannon they're toying with their script, pulling from Lovecraft, they're pulling from a lot of things. Like O'Bannon has been quoted as saying, "I don't steal from anyone, I steal from everyone." So he's pulling from Lovecraft, from It, The Terror from Beyond, which is a 1950s sci-fi movie that's pretty cool, and pulled very heavily from Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires. Their script had a crew of kind of working class astronauts, all actually male in the original script, who are returning to Earth when they're sidetracked by a message from a remote planet. So they've got reports that there might be an alien life form on the planet, so they send a small team to investigate. And then it's there that they find an ancient-looking abandoned spacecraft, and inside the spacecraft, they find a room of egg-like shells with spidery-looking little creatures. One of them jumps out and attaches to the face of the astronaut. So they've already got all of this stuff in their script at this point. This is actually one of Shusett's major contributions to the script. He imagined a creature that operated like there's a type of a wasp that latches itself onto a spider and uses it as a host to plant an egg. It's wild. I watched footage of it on YouTube.
He describes like watching a documentary, like a nature documentary, and seeing it. He was saying there was like this grub that was hides under a piece of bark, and it's sitting there, and then the insect slowly walks over and is like walking over the bark, and he said you even see it stop, and it like backs up. All of a sudden this needle comes out, and it just shoves this needle all the way through the bark and into the grub below it and injects its eggs. And he said that was just like super freaky.
It's super freaky because eggs are inside of another creature now. And I even watched some like time lapse footage of this caterpillar that had the eggs implanted in it, and you just see these little larvae start to burst out of it. So that's just their weird life cycle. It's fucking terrifying. Bugs are gross.
Can we post that?
Yeah, I'll find it again. It's out there
because that's messed up, man.
So that's where Shusett gets the idea. Only of course the alien's life cycle is accelerated, but that allowed it to change shape after it enters the ship. It's sort of ingenious. I mean, the fact that it hadn't been done before is wild to think of now, but it's a really genius idea of a way to get an alien inside of a spaceship.
Yeah.
So Shusett gave him, he told him his idea of using this wasp as inspiration, and O'Bannon listened to it, mulled it over. And then that night he wakes up in the middle of the night. Remember, he's still sleeping on Shusett's couch. He walks over to Shusett's bedroom, knocks on the door, and proposes an idea. You know, he'd been thinking this over, and all of a sudden Shusett's idea and another idea of his kind of clicked together. And this is an idea that would eventually be one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. So O'Bannon comes to Shusett and he says, the monster bursts out of his stomach. So he explained to Shusett that the alien not only lays its egg inside of the human, but it grows inside and emerges as a baby violently bursting out of its host. And that idea, of course, was very personal for O'Bannon because that's what his Crohn's disease felt like. And O'Bannon also very specifically wanted it to be a man that got infected. He specifically wanted to take the trope that John Carpenter had used, the idea of a woman as your victim, and break it. He said, quote, having the victim in a horror movie always be a woman was a cheap shot. I always imagined the director jerking off. Oh, I can't wait to see that woman get chopped to pieces. No, I want to see a man get it because I knew it would make the men uneasy. So he's aiming this movie towards men in the audience because that's who is typically watching like a horror movie, you know, at this time in the late 1970s. And he wanted them to feel freaked out by seeing a man get victimized on screen.
Yeah, it's weird. He talks a little bit about wanting to avoid like the final girl phenomena, but it is interesting. I mean, Ripley still kind of ends up in that way, but she's certainly more resourceful and stronger.
Yeah, I mean, but again, that wasn't his. This is early on in his script, and at this point, Ripley is not written as a woman.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, Ripley was never written as a woman. But in his original version of the script, he specifically had an all-male crew because of this very reason. He wanted to see the men be the ones running from the monster.
Wow.
So that chest burster scene, the iconic chest burster scene, that was the first major decision that O'Bannon made that helped to make the film what would become an iconic one. I mean, there are, and we'll discuss that scene in detail here in a bit, but it is one of the most famous movie scenes in history. So coming up with that idea, that's step one to like this movie being the iconic film that it is. The second decision that he made that would turn out to be incredibly important to the making of this film was to pick H.R. Giger to design the creature. And this is a pretty bold move. I mean, if you've seen Giger's paintings, the ones that we described earlier, you would understand. I mean, they're very obscene. They're very off-putting. They look like nothing like any movie monster that's ever been created. So in the middle of writing the script, O'Bannon calls Giger, explains to him, and Giger doesn't speak very good English, so he's like kind of overly articulating his words as he's speaking to Giger. He's telling him the general outline of the movie, and then he sent Giger a package that included a check for $1,000 and some sketches by Ron Cobb. That was, remember that one of his production designers on Dark Star, some sketches that Ron Cobb and O'Bannon had done, along with a list of stuff that he wanted designed. And although the final designs were fully Giger's, I mean, if you've seen Giger's work and then you see the designs on Alien, those are his. But it's very obvious when you start looking at what O'Bannon was doing on this film, even before there was a director attached, that he had a very real vision of what he wanted this movie to look like. Like when he's sending these notes to Giger, he's describing the temple where the ship held the alien egg as ancient, primitive, and cruel. He told Giger that he wanted to see the alien in 3 different forms, the first of which he described as a small octopoidal creature. And then the third version, the full-grown monster, he described in his note to Giger, he just says it as a, quote, profane abomination. That's the only description he gave to Giger. And Giger ran with it.
And nailed every single version.
Yeah, he did.
They are all terrifying.
They are. And the producers didn't quite get it. Even that $1,000, like the producers were supposed to send that. That was kind of their deal when they were trying to sign Giger on, was like, hey, we'll go ahead and send you $1,000 now to start doing some sketches. And the producers didn't want to do it because they didn't really believe in the idea of having Giger on it. So O'Bannon wrote that check out of his personal account and sent him $1,000. The producers actually suggested the monster be an oversized, deformed baby. And O'Bannon told Giger, he's like, I told him, but then I was just like, I mean, here's the idea that they have, but just kind of do what you want with it. So he didn't really push it. Like, he's like, yeah, I'll forward that message on to Hans.
Right.
And and then I've done my job. I've done my part. Then whatever he brings back is whatever he brings back.
With Giger, like the cool part is that like biomechanical stuff you're talking about. Like even if you look at with like the best example would be like the space jockey in the film is just like, it's like he's grafted into the seat or whatever. That's like totally a Giger thing. Where does the tech end and the biology begin on that? O'Bannon, like he had like specific ideas, but the craftiest part of this is like he did seem to be willing to work with everybody. For instance, they talk about the face hugger. He had described it, like you said, like kind of like an octopus like creature or something. And Giger sends over the art, and he tells the story that they actually had to go to LAX to pick up the art like from customs because they got it. And they were all like, what the fuck is this? They had no idea what was going on with these paintings. They had to like personally go and say like, no, it's for a movie, and like explain everything to get it out of customs. He said, Giger had like one thing designed. But the biggest part of his design that he liked was the thing. He said it was like more flat, but it had these fingers instead of like tentacles, like what he had envisioned. But he thought the fingers just looked like the creepiest thing in the world. And he said, all right, no matter
knuckles on them.
Yeah. He was like, no matter what happens from here, I'm going to use that. Like that has to make it in the movie. That is the creepiest thing. So it's not even till later when like Ridley Scott's on board that they finish up the design of it, because like Scott has ideas about like kind of the shape of what it would look like. But O'Bannon actually seems to negotiate it with he ends up taking a part of what Scott liked and then taking Giger's design. He goes in it and this is later on, in the making of the film, but he draws out himself. Like O'Bannon draws up the pictures in with Ron Cobb, like sitting in the room. Like he draws up the faces and takes Giger's painting and copies it in detail and draws up the face hugger all himself. This is all O'Bannon. And
remember, he's an artist that's his background.
Yeah. And so it's just crazy, just like how much work he put into it. So he draws this whole thing up and he brings it to Scott. And it's like, this look good. And he's like, yep, that's it. He even had Ron Cobb just for the added thing to it, that he wanted it to be so detailed that the skeletal structure underneath, like when you see it from the bottom, that it would make sense. So he had Ron Cobb actually come in and like design like what the bones would look like.
Yeah, because remember, Ron Cobb is a illustrator who is he was very concerned with things being scientifically accurate.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a really cool part, I thought.
Because I think Giger's original face hugger was like huge. It was really big, and it had this big long like tail that was like a spiral that would, so he would spring out of the egg and latch on, but it was like bigger than a dude's head. It was really large. So even though he has a singular vision, he worked. When they came back with notes on things to change, he would change them accordingly. It wasn't like he was like, no, this is like how I'm going to do it, and if you don't like it, you can stuff it. But I
figured we owed it to him for as grumpy as we make him sound sometimes. He was like negotiating these things out and taking different ideas and putting them. I mean, even from the color of the thing, he talks about, when he got the design down, he took it to the sculptors and they made like a clay version of the face hugger. And they did a molding, but they hadn't colored it yet. He had always pictured it like green, like reptilian. And as he and Scott were like looking at it, there was something away. He said it was just like that weird flesh tone to it. And he said he was like talking to Scott and like, man, we should just leave it just like this. This is kind of weirder. Yeah. Like nothing's been done like this before.
Well, in terms of the face hugger, the thing that stuck out to me is when they go in to initially examine it and it's laid out on the table and they start lifting parts. And I mean, I've seen this movie before, but just this time watching it was just like, that looks fucking real.
That's because it's oysters, a bunch of oysters.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, man. Wow.
They didn't have the technology for prosthetic that was that good didn't really exist at the time. So yeah, that's a bunch of like seafood and shit that's sitting in there. Yeah.
Oh man, that looks. I clearly didn't know, but that looks great.
I love how I know we're gonna get to it, but just with like you're talking about some of those special effects, just how loose they are with some of these ideas. Just even to hear him talk about Ash later on, Scott's just like he's like, we don't have the technology, or like what's it going to take to make something look really futuristic and robotic? And it's just like, I don't know, let's just stuff it full of noodles and glass spheres.
Marbles.
And he's like, that just looks so advanced, I don't know what the fuck's going on.
All right, so with the designs in the works and Giger on board, O'Bannon and Shusett finish the script. They send it back to Roger Corman, and he offers them $750,000 for it this time, which O'Bannon thought was a pretty generous offer. I mean, that's a lot of money coming from Roger Corman. But Shusett thought that they could shop it around. See, Star Wars had just opened, and it was a big hit. Let's say, which meant
some
that studios
would say it's successful.
It's a successful film. So that meant the studios were more keen to buy a sci-fi project. And the fact that Corman had jumped on to buy it so quickly made him think that, hey, other studios who might offer us more would probably do that too. And he was right.
Kids, you're now finding out that if it weren't for George Lucas, all of your favorite movies wouldn't exist.
Yeah, that's not untrue. But so Alan Ladd Jr., the executive at 20th Century Fox who had greenlit Star Wars, happened to be looking for another space epic. He had hired a trio of filmmakers to come up with a darker sci-fi movie, one that kind of married sci-fi with horror. And those filmmakers were named David Giler, Gordon Carroll, and Walter Hill, together known as Brandywine Productions. So of the three, Hills is probably the name that our listeners might recognize. Before this, he was known for writing hard-edged screenplays for movies like The Getaway and The Drowning Pool. He would later go on to direct stuff like The Warriors, 48 Hours, and Red Heat. Hill and Giler had sold themselves to Fox, had sold Brandywine Productions to Fox as like they were writers who could punch up a script and get rid of the filler. So that was kind of their thing. It's like, you hire us to produce this. We're going to take a screenplay that has a good hook maybe, but isn't quite ready to go into production, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to make it a viable box office success.
Nice. It's a good
So
gig
one day
if,
a guy
good
named-
gig if you can get it.
Yeah, I mean, and because especially with Hill, he had the background. He had written several movies that had been successful. So one day a guy named Mark Haggard, who was an old USC friend of O'Bannon's, visited Hill in their office at Brandywine Productions and dropped off a copy of the Alien script. And he's like, you should read this, and you should, should consider directing this film. So Hill didn't know who O'Bannon and Shusett were, but he was looking for a sci-fi movie because that's what Fox wanted. So he took it home and read it, and he got about a quarter of a way into it, and he stopped reading to call Giler. He told Giler, he's like, this script is kind of terrible, but there's this really great scene about a third of the way in where an alien incubated inside of a person bursts out of his stomach. So he found that chest burster scene alone was enough. That was worth building on. That was worth working on the script because he's like, I had never seen anything like this before.
To his credit, I mean, that's like one of the most memorable movie scenes of all time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So O'Bannon and Shusett signed a deal with Brandywine, but there was a bit of tension. Let's go. I'm going to go ahead and say Hill and Giler are also another couple of grumpy dudes who were involved in the production of this movie. Hill he seems difficult as well. Very set in his ways.
Definitely in the commentary stuff and interviews I saw, O'Bannon does not like Hill. Like
no,
he thinks he's like a dickhead, pretty much.
I mean, he kind of comes across as one, to be honest. I like Hill as a filmmaker. I like some of his movies a lot, but so there was some tension because Hill and Giler, they started making changes to the script, which is again their job. But Shusett and O'Bannon were not happy with this. Shusett would later say in an interview, they weren't good at making it better, or in fact, at not making it even worse. So, but Hill and Giler, they added some significant elements to the story, including the character of Ash. That character did not exist in O'Bannon's original version of the script. They went through 8 different drafts of the script, and a lot of those rewrites concentrated heavily on the Ash subplot, but also on making the dialogue more natural, which I think they did a superb job at personally.
Yeah, I was wondering because there's a couple moments where I was like, is that scripted? That sounds so off the cuff.
That comes from, I think, Hill's script and also the direction of the film, because there's a lot of this like cool overlapping dialogue that's very like Robert Altman-esque, where people are talking. You have to kind of decide on who you're going to listen to. Robert Altman was very well known for doing that, and Steven Spielberg does it. He does it in Jaws a good bit, and in Close Encounters. But
some of the
just
people
makes it
said
feel
that
more natural,
Very.
Some of the dialogue in the original, I think it was Hill that described it kind of as, well, somebody had described it as poetic, and in some interview Hill said no, it was pretentious and obscure. But I don't know. O'Bannon didn't like any of this. Like O'Bannon was unhappy with this. He talked about like how hard he worked to not give psychological profiles to all of these characters, and to he said, you're tempted to give these things in good movies. You see this all the time. He said, except for one thing, it always bores the hell out of me, except in so much it has bearing on the situation at hand. Quote, I didn't want to stop and tell life stories of these characters because I didn't give a rat's ass. I cared about the monster that was going to kill them, so I didn't do any of that. And his dialogue was like, stuff shouldn't be there that wouldn't be just natural yes and no conversation. They're real people in a real situation with real history. It doesn't matter why they're there. Who gives a shit?
I'm not sure I agree with that, but
but O'Bannon, that's how O'Bannon is, and he hated Ash. Like, he thought that was stupid. He did not think much of a robot being there. He calls it the Russian spy treatment. He says it's like Fantastic Voyage. He says it's annoying. He says, why does there always have to be a Russian spy? He says it's a common tension device. He describes it as like, in Fantastic Voyage, it's like you're getting to go do all of this awesome stuff, but then you find out there's a Russian spy. He says, quote, It's an inferior idea from inferior minds that in this movie is well acted and well directed. Fortunately, it does not take up too much time.
Well, Ron Shusett in later interviews would say that it was one of the better contributions to the script. He said he thought it was a genius idea adding the Ash character, and maybe that's just Shusett being much more neutrally or more playing politics a little bit more or a little bit better than O'Bannon does. But Shusett seems to really like the idea and thought it was an excellent idea to add the Ash character to the story.
Yeah, I just I had to make sure we cover. It just feels like so O'Bannon. That's a direct quote from the commentary. It's an inferior idea from inferior minds that's well acted and well directed. Fortunately, it doesn't take up too much time.
I kind of love how cranky he is, honestly. I love it. He's a fun guy to watch in interviews too, because he's like, if you see him in later interviews, like where he's older, he's got the white hair and the glasses, and he's always wearing like a bow tie and suspenders.
Right.
He's a character. So Walter Hill takes the idea to Alan Ladd, and he's like, this is B movie material, but if we dress it up with A movie production values, we could fool the audience into thinking it's an A movie. That was kind of his pitch to Alan Ladd. And Alan Ladd went for it, but with one caveat. He said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it big. He wanted Alien to look like a blockbuster. He essentially wanted another Star Wars. And just like that, this little monster movie that was supposed to star a guy in a rubber suit became a $10 million event film for a major studio. And this was a huge deal for Dan O'Bannon, for his career as well as for his health, because 1977, when this is all going down, had been very tough for him health-wise. His Crohn's disease had sent him in and out of the hospital multiple times that year. And, things are looking up finally for Dan. With Alien, he was given screenwriting credit on the film, despite the fact that the shooting script was written by Hill and Giler. But he also negotiated to where he had a say in the look of the film. And in doing that, he was able to bring in his old co-workers from Dune, illustrator Chris Foss, Mobius, and Ron Cobb.
Yeah, I love the addition of Ron Cobb. I mean, we'll not forget that he's from Dark Star as well. But he had also done apparently uncredited work on Star Wars for like creature designs. Like,
oh yeah, really?
Yeah, just interesting, like creature concepts and stuff like that. So he was kind of blazing his own trail in the industry there. And he seems to be another guy that O'Bannon bounced ideas off of pretty regularly.
Yeah, they seem to be big collaborators, more than just I'm going to hire you to design. Like they bounced ideas off each other a lot, it seemed.
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, like the acid blood, that's Ron Cobb.
That was Ron Cobb, yep.
Yeah, he had just
genius idea.
Yeah, O'Bannon was like basically stuck at this point of why don't they just kill him? Why don't they just kill the alien? Like he didn't want, he thought it was too tropey to like include this like bulletproof monster. He thought that
right.
He wanted it to seem real, like biological, like this is a real thing. And so, yeah, you could shoot it up and it would die. But like, why wouldn't you do that? And besides the fact that these are space truckers, so they're not just walking around with guns.
Aliens.
But yeah, that's what they do in Aliens. But he said he was talking to Ron Cobb about it. Ron Cobb just came up with the ideas like, what if you just had a acid for blood, and it would just like burn through the ship if it like melts metal. And hey, it's like O'Bannon's just like, yes, that's perfect.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
So now you don't kill it.
So O'Bannon's vision for Alien was similar to what Jodorowsky wanted to do on Dune, which was you put a bunch of great artists in a room together and let them trade ideas and bounce things off each other, And the plan was for Ron Cobb to design the spaceships using the latest cutting edge science. Remember, as we discussed in our Dark Star episode, Cobb was a designer who liked his sci-fi designs to seem functional. Only this time the budget would allow them to use more than, just egg cartons and ice cube trays in the design. But they still saw the aesthetic, much like in Dark Star, as dirty, industrial, rusted, that used space look that had never really been seen before. Giger's style, on the other hand, had no basis in science. He did not care at all if his alien looked like it could biologically exist. It didn't have eyes. Like, who cares? Giger wasn't worried about the science of it. He just wanted to create something that looked scary. He could give a shit if it's something that is based in science.
I even thought, I think I saw somewhere where he like even had eyes at first and then took them off. I was like, nah, it's going to be creepier if it sniffs you out.
Oh, yeah.
And his designs for the alien were based on his painting Necronom 4. If you ever Google that if you want, and you'll see an alien xenomorph. That's what's in that painting. He made several conceptual paintings of the creature before settling on the final version, and then he sculpted the creature himself. Although the creature's head was created by a guy named Carlo Rambaldi, who'd worked on the aliens on Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Carlo Rambaldi is a kind of a legendary effects guy and would eventually win an Oscar for his work on this film. And he stuck pretty close to Giger's design, but he did make some modifications to the head that would allow him to turn it into this fully articulated head. It had, hinges for the mouth, cables, and, for allowing that inner mouth to extend, things like that. And then they covered the whole thing in slime, and that slime was actually just KY jelly.
Which is why it seems like your mom at some points. Like it just she's always just covered in KY. There was a joke. There was a joke there. There was your mama joke somewhere in there. I dropped the ball.
In space, no one can hear you spank it.
I was going to go in space. No one can hear you cream.
Oh yeah, I see what you're going
that wins. Yeah.
And you're the writer comedian here.
I'll take the silver. I'll take the silver medal. That's fine.
Wait, why does that mean I got? Well, I kind of gave up on mine halfway through, so it's only fair. So okay, fine. But yeah, the cool part here is that the Giger style, it's fantastic, like just the way this thing looks. A lot of Scott was saying, the interiors and stuff of those ships are all Ron Cobb. He actually gives credit to him for like most of that. And but then the Giger stuff is like anything alien is Giger, and like pretty much anything human is like Ron Cobb did a lot of that design work.
Yeah.
And
Chris Foss did a lot of concept. His kind of whole thing was conceptual design of the exteriors of the spaceships. Ron Cobb did a lot of the interiors and figuring out the design of how the spaceship could actually function. Whereas Chris Foss, like he was a sci-fi illustrator. He did sci-fi novel covers, and so that was kind of his thing, was creating the stuff on the outside of the Nostromo.
Yeah. And my apologies. I'm like bouncing all back and forth with like jumping into the actual production of the film itself, but instead of just the designs where you're really talking about. But anyway, I just remember reading a bunch about this, and just it was really cool. O'Bannon was here too, though. Like he had ideas, once they actually got into designing them. Like Cobb had done all straight hallways, so like O'Bannon was thinking of the tension of the thing. It was talking about he made him go he suggested redesigning the hallways to have like corners. He's like, you want blind spots, so you don't know what's around the turn. Like you got to have that stuff.
It's a great idea. So things are looking up for O'Bannon, but being O'Bannon, he is a pessimist at heart. He always kind of expected things to go wrong. He was worried that the studio would change his script or try to stop him from using Giger's designs. And those things kind of did happen. The studio started to get nervous. Hill and Giler are already changing the script, but the studio, they started to get unsure about this, because as we'll talk about the casting in a bit, but even as it started to get cast, like none of the people who are in it are like big movie stars. Although if they had looked back at, Star Wars, nobody in that was a movie star either. The writers were unproven, and those Giger designs were not exactly family friendly. They were like, how are parents who took their kids to Star Wars going to feel about a monster with a head that looks like a big black dick?
Well, families today have Pornhub, so that's just common. They don't have to worry.
And there's lots of families on Pornhub, so
step families, really.
It's a lot of step families.
What are you doing, Step Todd?
But one of them's away on business a lot.
So the studio also had a director problem here. Walter Hill left the film once he realized that he's like, there's going to be a lot of special effects in this movie. And he was kind of always bored of the idea of doing special effects work. I don't know how he initially didn't think this was going to be an effects heavy movie when he read the script, but that was his reasoning for leaving. But there was probably another reason. One, that he never really had a lot of faith in the project. It didn't seem. He never really seemed to be that into it. Plus, he had another movie that he wanted to work on. He had another movie that it was kind of in development that he wanted to work on. So he left to go work on that project. That project would end up being Southern Comfort, which is a really good movie, but it's not Alien.
Yeah, I was going to say. All right.
Although maybe a Walter Hill version of Alien would not have been this movie at all, you know?
True.
So Fox goes looking for other directors, and several of them turn the project down until eventually the job was accepted by a newcomer by the name of Ridley Scott. I'm sure you know that name. He's incredibly famous now, but at the time he was relatively new. Ridley Scott's an English director. He'd gotten his start in filmmaking by making television commercials, was very well known as a commercial director. And he had recently made his film debut with the 1977 film The Duelist, which won the award for Best Debut Film at the Cannes Film Festival.
Supposedly this guy Sanford Lieberson had seen that movie, who worked for like 20th Century Fox London division, and he was the first person that started like passing script stuff over to Scott when the director stuff started to go up in the air, had been pushing it over to him.
Well, I mean, it's funny because there's nothing about The Duelist that makes you think this guy needs to do a sci-fi movie, you know, because The Duelist is about it's about two duelists in like Napoleonic France. There's nothing fantastic about it at all. And it had not been like a big hit at the box office, but like we said, it had won some acclaim, some critical acclaim and some awards. And it had caught Hollywood's attention because of how it looks, because of this flashy aesthetic, because there's one thing about Ridley Scott. I'm hit or miss on Ridley Scott as a director. Like, I think he can be very, very good, but I think he can be bad as well. But there's one thing, good or bad, regardless of how I feel about the film, one of his films as a whole, is that they always look fantastic. And that's because, again, he got his start in commercials, and he had a background in that kind of stuff. He had to be able to tell stories in a visual sense in 30 seconds at a time. There are Ridley Scott movies, like, obviously this is a very high point, this movie, but something like Legend, I do not like Legend at all. I think Legend is very boring and not a good movie, but I think it looks gorgeous. And that's kind of, that visual style is what caught Hollywood's attention. That's what made people think of him for even movies like this that didn't seem to be, in the wheelhouse of what he had made before. And Ridley Scott, he actually, after the success of Star Wars, he actually saw where the tide was turning, and he wanted to work on a space film next. So when Fox came to him and offered him Alien, he jumped on the opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, Ronald Shusett tells this story that, like, when Scott was approached, and now at this point, they'd supposedly been through potential directors. Scott says he was fifth on the list.
Any idea who the other ones were?
Yeah, some of the names I saw were Peter Yates, Jack Clayton, well, obviously Walter Hill. There was a point Dan O'Bannon was considered for the directing role, and Robert Aldrich, who did I just watched the other day Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and he did that movie. Yeah. And I thought it was fantastic. It was my first time seeing it, and I really, really loved that movie. But one thing that drove me nuts is I saw that he was actually the closest, supposedly, out of those names before Walter Hill. And they said that he lost the job because they came up to him talking about the design of the face hugger, and they said Aldrich just shrugged and said, I think we'll just put some entrails on the guy's face. It's not like anybody's going to remember that thing once they left the theater.
So, he clearly did not have a grasp on the screenplay at all.
Yeah. And so anyway, yeah, but Ridley Scott, according to Ronald Shusett, and this is interesting because there is a story, and I think you have it in your notes too to talk about later, but like of O'Bannon showing them Texas Chainsaw. But Shusett tells a story that says the first thing that Ridley Scott told him when they were talking to him about the job, because Shusett, he was co-writer, but he's also a producer on here. He said that Scott said, I want to make a straightforward, unpretentious, riveting thriller. I'm thinking Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, or even brilliant B-level stuff like Night of the Living Dead or Texas Chainsaw. He said, and he's like, but I want it to look he said, quote, and I want it to look, and I'm going to do this. It's going to be those things, and it's going to look like 2001.
Yeah,
And,
that's awesome. What a great approach.
Yeah.
Great
approach. And he said just the way he talked about it, he was like, I knew he could do it. And I didn't, he said he had seen like The Duelist and thought maybe this would be like a pretentious guy, but he said that he and O'Bannon and Scott throughout the making of the movie would sit and watch all kinds of scare movies because they wanted to learn, like it was important to get the timing down. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later too. But, for all those who doubt Alien as a horror movie, I mean, that's 100% the thought process that.
Are there alien doubters?
I don't know. I just think I don't know. Like when people think of like favorite horror movies, I don't know that like Alien for casual viewers would be like a first that would.
I don't know, man. Yeah. I mean, I think people get caught up in the fact that it's set in space and they're like, oh, it's a sci-fi. No, it's a horror. Like it can be fucking both. It can be a sci-fi and a horror movie, and it is both. And it's not the first or the last movie to be both a horror movie and a sci-fi movie. So that's like, you don't have to put it in one or the other.
And I
it's
could be just making that
movie.
Up.
It's a haunted house movie that happens to be set in space.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, I didn't think about it like that. That's true.
Oh, that's 100% the way he'll pitch Harry Dean Stanton, but we'll talk about that later. But like the, I mean, O'Bannon and Shushit, they 100% were thinking of it with horror. So I think Scott sold him that he also was coming into this like, nah, man,
more as a horror movie than a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, and he's like, it's a B movie, a B horror movie, and we're gonna make it look like 2001.
Yeah,
and,
which is again how Hill initially sold it to Alan Ladd, and even though Hill is no longer a director, he's still a producer of this. Brandywine Productions is still producing, so Hill's actually still involved as well. So here we are. We've got Ridley Scott, we've got a script, we've got H.R. Giger. All these things are coming into place to create this movie, but now we've got to get a cast. So with only 7 human characters in the story, Ridley Scott knew that he needed strong actors in the roles so that he could focus on the film's visual style, because he is a very visual director.
Can I say something about Ridley really quickly that I love about him? One of the things that, now, of course, I'm basing this solely on interviews with Ridley himself, but who knows what he acts like on set? But he seems like, with all of these movies that we've talked about, he seems to be very much about collaboration, and he realizes the importance of everybody on set, not just himself. Like, obviously, he has a creative vision, and he talks a lot in stuff I saw about the cast. You got to feel that in your gut, and it's 50% of your problem solved if you get the right cast. They're going to help you with a lot of the decisions that get made and a lot of things that happen in the scenes. He said that with this cast that he put together, he felt like basically that he had nailed it, that they knew something special was happening right when they were going in there. Now, he wondered about how people felt about it, because he does say he can be an ass on set from time to time. But his interesting quote there was, he says, nobody respects you for being nice, and you got to get it done, and you wear what you got when it's over. So you got to make sure at the end of the day, your vision is the one that makes it on screen, because you're living with it for the rest of your life. There's going to be issues. You hear about Dan O'Bannon coming into this, and for all intents and purposes, Dan O'Bannon had no other place on set. Like, Dan O'Bannon didn't have to be involved with Jack nor shit with Alien at this point, really. And it seemed like Scott in the commentary talks about, and maybe this is a better point for later, but he says that he always felt like he was searching for Dan O'Bannon's approval on the movie, and he's not sure that he ever got it. And which is sad, but he said he loved Dark Star. Dan had experience directing there, or just like in his collaboration with John Carpenter, and he wanted to live up to, he thought a lot of John Carpenter, but he wanted to live up to what Dan was expecting. He said that he always felt that Dan's innermost feeling was to be the director, like that he wanted to take control of the whole shot, the whole shoot. He knew coming in that Scott wasn't a sci-fi fan. Like initially, he was just doing this because, as we discussed last episode, Justin mentioned that Star Wars had just happened. So sci-fi was hot. And he knew that Scott was like the fifth choice of directors. And Scott knew that he was the fifth choice, but he wanted to honor the vision of the original screenwriters. And he knew that he had initially Ronald Shusett.
Struggle with that one.
I do struggle with it every time. He had his approval.
Yes.
He gave him a lot of great feedback, but Dan O'Bannon was not so forthcoming with a lot of approval. And so it was kind of sad hearing that.
I mean, O'Bannon seems like a tough guy to please, honestly, especially when something is like his baby, you know, and that's what it feels like Alien is. And he felt like I think it might stem from the fact that he got fucked over so bad by John Carpenter that he doesn't want to go through that again. He doesn't want another director fucking him over and taking all of the credit for something that is rightfully at least somewhat his.
Yeah.
And I think he spent most of his career afraid that was going to happen. And unfortunately it could kind of continue to happen over and over to him.
Anyway, so here we are, and Ridley Scott's on board. He's quite the character himself, and he gets to choose his cast, which, like I said, he views as like 50% of the movie right there, just as part of getting this right.
So as we mentioned in our last episode, in O'Bannon's earliest versions of the script, the crew of the Nostromo was all male. But he and Shusett later wrote the roles that were more generic, even putting a note in the script. If you look at the script, and I'm not sure if this was a note by O'Bannon and Shusett or by Hill and Geiler, but there's a note on the script that says the crew is unisex and all parts are interchangeable for men or women. So this gave Scott and his casting director the freedom to interpret the characters however they wanted.
Do you know what's weird, by the way, side note, is that on some anthology thing later, and I don't know if it's from this note, and you saying that kind of made me think of this, but they had included some note about Dallas and one of the other characters, and I can't remember who, afforded like transition in sex. Like it had like
it was.
Do you know what it's about?
Yeah, it was Lambert, Veronica Cartwright's character, and it's in Aliens. When you see, there's something about when you see, I think the list of when in Aliens when Ripley is being debriefed, I guess you see like a list of the Nostromo's crew, and there's something about that. But it was I guess written in James Cameron's like character dossiers.
Okay.
Yeah, so which you can read, I think, on the Alien or the Aliens, like that quadrilogy box set or whatever. But yeah, the Lambert role was written as a trans character.
That's interesting. I just I don't know. I just thought that was
I had never known that before until like yesterday. I think I read that.
That's cool.
Yeah. So talking about the cast, the Nostromo's captain, one of the first roles to be cast was Tom Skerritt as Dallas. Skerritt had actually originally read the screenplay early on in the film's development. He was approached pretty early on, but he turned it down because he was unimpressed with the writing quality of the script and unimpressed with the film's budget, which at that point they were, envisioning as a Roger Corman low budget horror movie. Because he said this in an interview, he's like, I thought it was going to end up looking like an Ed Wood movie. If you try to do a sci-fi movie on this kind of budget, it's going to look like Plan 9 from Outer Space. But then after the screenplay was rewritten and the budget was expanded, he was approached again, and then he signed on. He saw the improvement and saw the potential of the project.
I saw the name Harrison Ford was tossed around in a couple of places, but I couldn't ever find like a verification from someone.
I mean, I'm sure in 1977 Hollywood, after American Graffiti and Star Wars had come out, Harrison Ford's name was probably on every casting director's list for any role.
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
that probably makes sense. Yeah. But yeah, I also see something I was trying to find more information about, but apparently Skerritt pulled that thing of when he came back in of asking for a percentage of the profits too from this, which may have been the case. But Ridley says that he just loved how Skerritt chose to play Dallas. Just that
very chill
Yeah, just that he was laid back when everybody, he felt like everybody else would have taken this role and played him as like very brute and forceful and just rugged or something. And Scarrett played him with this like real, like just easygoing personality. And like he tried to stay out of arguments and just, that kind of thing. And just, he thought that was
very
really
non-confrontational.
Yeah. Just there to do the job, get the job done.
So for the role of Ripley, Scott wanted that character to be female and cast in that role was a 29-year-old off-Broadway actress by the name of Sigourney Weaver. Weaver had she didn't really have any film experience before this. She appears very briefly in, I think it's Annie Hall, the Woody Allen movie. She appears in like one scene, but she was primarily a stage actor and not a very well-known one at the time. She had actually originally been considered for the role of Lambert, but when she auditioned, Ridley Scott actually encouraged her to take the lead role.
Yeah, Scott swears he knew Weaver like right at the beginning, like the second she walked in. He swears he was sold on her, and Weaver said she was wearing her hooker boots that day, so that's probably why. But
I mean, she's already like 6 feet, 6'1". She's really tall, so maybe if with added heels on, she probably would have looked pretty imposing.
Yeah. There were rumors, again about like somebody like Meryl Streep was pretty close or something like that. But I don't know. In the stuff I saw, Scott was adamant that he knew it was going to be Sigourney Weaver right when he saw her. And that he felt like one of the master strokes of this movie was making her the leader, like the final person, like the one in charge, like just her presence and authority that she carries. And that in most movies she might be like one of the first to go, like in a normal horror movie, but like in this one she's the person.
Well, what's interesting about that is that she is not like any kind of leader or even a main character for the first 40 minutes of the movie, probably.
Yeah.
Well, she has these moments of like,
yeah, but she barely speaks early on in the movie. Nothing that would indicate, if you've never seen the movie, that she would end up being the main character.
Yeah. It's like she slowly like pushes her way in, but yeah. Towards the time where they finally come back from the alien spaceship, there's the moments where you can see like little details. Like she obviously, like while everybody's investigating the ship, she doesn't like Ash. She doesn't trust Ash for some reason. Yeah. And by the way, side note, I have my dog is named Ripley. I just wanted to throw that out there based on this character. I also have a cat named Ash, but that was from Evil Dead. But for the sake of this episode, it could be based on this android. They also tend to fight with each other. Anyway, Shusett says that the studio, like for a little while, some of the people from the studio when they were watching the dailies didn't even like Sigourney Weaver that much. Like they thought she was like underplaying it too much. Like that she didn't like she needs to be, I don't know, something more. And he said he actually went to bat for her, like talked about that he and Scott all thought it was like, man, look at her eyes though. Like the eyes is where it's at. And he said he used the Orson Welles quote when he was talking about Gary Cooper. Apparently he said that camera either loves you or it doesn't, all in the eyes. And he was like, Sigourney Weaver just had something about her. Just in her face. Weaver even tells a story about being in when the sitting with the casting director and Scott's like asking her like, what do you think this movie's like? What do you feel about this? And she's like, I don't know. It feels really bleak. She said the casting director was like sitting over next to her like, no. Just shut up. But like Scott's like, I mean, that's it though. That's what this is.
You got it. That's what it is.
But another thing they did was they ran through like stuff. I didn't know this until I was watching the commentary, that they brought in like a bunch of girls from the offices and had her run through lines and like watched her act out like one of the scenes or something and asked the women what they thought about Sigourney Weaver. And people were like comparing her to Jane Fonda. There were like other comparisons, but like some of the women were just like, wow, she seems tough, And they actually took that as even more encouragement that we've got the right person. That was like, the women are behind this one.
That's cool.
The thing that stuck out to me was when the crew is coming back from the alien ship and she's keeping them in quarantine, but Ash lets them in. Her voice is so calm. You see her kind of stepping into that leadership role of, hey, I know this is going to be scary. Yes, he's got this thing attached to his face, but we have to maintain the quarantine. And then later when she starts hollering at different members of the crew, like you see the range and just she gets, this leadership role thrust upon her. And it's really fascinating to just watch the eyes. I mean, if you watch her eyes throughout this entire show, it's really fantastic.
I mean, she portrays more authority than Dallas ever did.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like she has more leadership qualities that we see here than Dallas ever did.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that moment you're talking about where she's refusing to let them on the ship, that's like the first step of, hey, she's making a better decision than Dallas is.
Yep.
As the captain, because she's following protocol regardless. And it turns out when you break quarantine, bad shit happens.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought?
Yeah.
I feel like you got something behind that, Justin.
So she had originally been called in to play Lambert, but got cast as Ripley. Veronica Cartwright had originally auditioned for Ripley, and she got cast as Lambert, which I thought was pretty fun. So, and then of course, as Brett, one of the Nostromo's engineer, is the great Harry Dean Stanton,
Yes.
who is just one of the all-time, just one of my favorite actors. I just love that guy. I love his face.
Everything
just
about him just seems cool.
Right.
He's so cool, man.
Right.
He really is.
Ridley Scott
And
says
then-
his very first words, Harry Dean Stanton's first words to him during the audition were, during the audition. So I feel like you've got to know a little bit about what you're doing when you come into audition. But he said Harry Dean Stanton's first words to him during the audition were, "I don't like science fiction and I don't like monsters."
but then Ridley Scott's like, yeah, neither do I.
As Scott said, he was amused by him, and he ended up trying to convince Harry Dean Stanton to take the role.
That really was Scott's response to that. He's like, neither do I, but I think I can make this one work.
But yeah, like, I mean, even during the commentary, like Harry Dean Stanton's just like so laid back. He's in there with like his little sections are with like Tom Skerritt and Cartwright. They're like talking about how Stanton's like, I just remember this one time where my character would say right after every time this guy said something. So I'd say right. And then, yeah. And he's like, I just thought that was a nice little touch that he'd be like busy doing other stuff and he'd just say right all the time. And then one time, like, I think he was talking to Skerritt. He's like, and then you were like in the middle of like the scene, you were like, why do you keep saying right after everything he says? And I'm like, why don't you go fuck yourself? And then Skerritt stood up and was like, if he gets to change lines, then I get to change my lines. And then Scott's like, all right, everybody calm down, Harry. Stop it.
Oh man, that's great. I really love Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah.
So the Nostromo's
Scott,
other engine.
Well, I just was going to say one other thing that I thought was very interesting is Scott said he was like also the nicest guy in the world, that like there's the scene where like they're doing the whole, the whole scene with the water coming down and the chains and everything, which by the way, Scott says he fought for. Everybody was like, this scene makes no sense. Like, what room is this in a ship that water's pouring down and there's chains hanging everywhere? And Scott's like,
I'm going to assume it's condensation from the cooling.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says condensation. And who gives a shit? It's a cool looking scene.
It looks cool.
Yeah.
He said that they got him to play all of this up. And by the way, on the special edition, there's a scene there that's cut out in the normal version where the alien is sitting on the chains, like curled up, just like watching him the whole time. And it's pretty fucking wicked. That's the one scene from the director's cut. We'll talk more about that later. But that's the one scene I'm like, it's pretty fucking wicked. Anyway, he said that they killed him and everything was done. And he was just like, Harry Dean Stanton. The only feedback he ever from that point on got from Harry Dean Stanton was Harry Dean Stanton walked up to him and was like, hey man, thank you so much for doing all those close-ups of my face. He was just
That's
like,
cool.
All right. He's like, so he's really pleasant. I don't know. He was just happy we took close-ups of him.
So the Nostromo's other engineer, Parker, was played by the Yaphet Kotto, the late great Yaphet Kotto, just died about 2 weeks ago, I think.
Yeah,
at the age of 81. He is. I love. There's another actor. I just love him. I mean, this is probably his most well-known role, I guess. But a few years earlier, he had been the villain in James Bond in Live and Let Die, which is not the best James Bond movie. It is the best James Bond theme song. But Live and Let Die it's a fun movie, but it's got it's one where they try to take some like blaxploitation elements to it. And then he plays Mr. Big, turns into Mr. Big at the end, which was like, I think Rick Baker's very first makeup job. And it's not very good.
I totally forgot about that, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's Yaphet. And he's incredible. There's something really commanding about his presence, but he's so natural. That's what is all of this cast, I think, is they bring a natural like element to their performances. They feel real. Part of it's because of how they look, but because they don't look like your typical Hollywood cast, but they all have this way of performing that feels just very real. Like you believe that these guys have lived together for months and months on a spaceship together. He was known to be kind of difficult on set, and he would antagonize other actors like purposely to get a performance out of them, like specifically Sigourney Weaver. He would try to get her energy level up, especially like in the scene where he says, like, I'm just for killing the goddamn thing, where they're like going back and forth. He was like intentionally antagonizing her to get her angry and sounding angry during that scene.
Well, I was actually about to bring that up, that I saw later that apparently was something he and Scott had talked about, that like that Scott had instructed him during that scene standing around, like, to keep cutting her off, interrupt her, like in the middle of her speaking her lines, like, try to her.
When I mentioned last week about some of the stuff felt really natural, that's the scene I had in mind, and it was just like, was that scripted? Because that feels so real.
It does. It's really good.
Yeah.
But Ronald Shusett says that one time during the filming, like they're standing there and Yaphet came up to him and was just like, thank you so much for this. Do you know I've been waiting 15 years for this? And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I've been waiting 15 years to be in one of the all-time great movies.
Oh, that's
he can tell, right?
And I just thought that was awesome. And then Shusett says the same thing. He was just like the foresight on him. Like it was really incredible.
Wow. That's crazy. And then, of course, we've got John Hurt cast as Kane. John Hurt, another actor who wasn't very well known at the time. Of course, he's incredibly well known now.
Yeah. He looks like a damn kid here.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that. I mean,
he looks super young here.
He looks younger than he does as like Ollivander and Harry Potter.
Sure.
But he's 39 here, and he looks older than 39 in this movie to me. Because I'm 39 and I feel like I look younger than what John Hurt looks like in this movie. He looks like he's had a harder life than I have at this point in his life.
He was one of those guys they went after too. Like they tried to get him, and then
he wasn't originally cast, right?
Yeah, I mean they wanted him and he couldn't do it because he had a job. And so they ended up hiring this guy, John Finch, and Finch ended up getting sick right before they started filming, and
while they were filming,
had diabetes. He found out he had diabetes.
Oh, geez.
And he had to go off of the movie.
Ridley Scott tells a story. Sorry to interrupt you, but Ridley Scott tells a story where John Finch, they're actually filming a scene with him, and he just has no energy and like looks awful. He's like yellow, and Ridley Scott says they stop the take and they're like, "Are you okay?" And he's like, I am not okay. Like I feel awful. And they had to like lift him out of the seat to help him offset. But yeah, he ended up finding out he had diabetes, and I guess his blood sugar was low, and he ended up dropping out of the film because of it.
So then what they ended up doing is because John Hurt was supposed to be filming this role in South Africa. He had been confused, he thinks, with John Hurd, like Home Alone.
Yeah,
like the dad in Home Alone. And, who had been
other stuff besides Home Alone.
But that you know what I'm talking about when I say the dad in Home Alone.
Yes.
But he said that he was on a like blacklist and or he couldn't go to work in South Africa. I'll just be honest with you, I'll be straight up. I felt weird about saying the blacklist and Africa all in the same thing. So, but he was on a list, like he couldn't act in Africa, like he couldn't come work there because Hurd had been very vocal about opposing apartheid. And so they didn't want him there. So Hurt was like, I also opposed it, but like, I don't think he's like, I wasn't on a list. Like I hadn't been like overly like protesting it or anything like Hurt has. So I think that's where the confusion was. Anyway, Hurt couldn't do the job. And so when Scott and stuff found out about that, they approached Hurt again and came and got him and talked to him like the night of, like he literally like drove all night that night after they got the call and came and worked on it.
Well, yeah, Ridley Scott went to his house and they like went and gave him like a pitch, you know, no time to like read the script. He's like, he pitched the film to him, and John Hurt was, you know, he liked it and he was like, okay, let's do this. You know, when do I start? And Ridley Scott's like, tomorrow morning. so he went on set the next day, had not met any of the other crew members or anything at that point. And for one of probably the most well-known roles of his career. And then you had Ian Holm cast as Ash, the cyborg science officer on the Nostromo.
Spoiler.
Well, we're hoping everyone has watched the movie at this point. But Ian Holm was another guy who, you know, we know him now because he was in, you know, the Terry Gilliam movies, The Hobbit and all that stuff.
Right.
But at the time, he was pretty much just a stage actor. He'd done a little bit of television here and there, but he was mostly a stage actor. And then we really have to mention a guy named Balaji Bodejo. So this is an actor who, he is the actor who plays the alien.
Yep.
And he was a Nigerian artist who was working as a graphic designer in London when a member of Ridley Scott's casting team spotted him in a pub. And at 6'9", he was picked to play the part due largely to his height, and he was very thin and had very long legs. So Alien, is really he's not like an actor. He's not a stunt man. He didn't go on to have a big stunt career. Alien is his only film credit.
Yep.
And his family would later like reveal that he actually returned to Nigeria in 1980, right after this movie, and opened his own art gallery there, which he continued to run, I think, through his death. He died he died pretty young, I believe. I forget why, but yeah, I mean, that's another stellar casting choice, because just, you know, you can't just cast anybody in that role or it's going to look like a man in a suit because of his proportions, because he is very thin, very, very tall, very long limbs. Like even when you put the man in a rubber suit, it doesn't look like just a guy in a suit, you know?
Right.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like I kept seeing his height listed everywhere from 6'9" to 7'1", so I never like could figure out.
Either way, that's
exactly
incredibly.
He's a very tall man, and supposedly they had him do some like Tai Chi and mime classes or something to kind of learn how to slow down his movements a little bit as they were getting him in there. But yeah, I mean, you can find quotes from him from like right around the time after the movie where, you know, he says like acting wasn't really his calling necessarily, but he's going to go back into graphic art. And he's like, unless another movie comes along. So it seems like he's like open to the idea. But anyway, poor guy could not sit down. They didn't realize that till they were already filming. He had that big
tail on the back of his suit.
Finally, somebody noticed. They're like, hey, man, guy can't sit down. So they had to build like a special swing for him on set that he could go sit in. But
tire or wooden plank.
but at this time, you know, with Star Wars and everything, I mean, the studio had pitched people like Peter Mayhew and stuff for this role. And so it's interesting they found this guy, and just out of nowhere, he's like beating out Peter Mayhew to like play this role, just which, I mean, no, it's perfect.
The thing with this cast, I mean, this cast is incredible. Like I said, they bring a really natural vibe to it in their performances, but I think also it's because they're not like a bunch of young kids, you know. Sigourney Weaver was 29 at the time, and she was the youngest of the cast. I think Veronica Cartwright was just a few months older than her. Tom Skerritt's like 46, you know, like Harry Dean Stanton's in his early 50s at this point. If you were casting this movie now, if Hollywood was making this movie now, everyone on the crew of the Nostromo would be like under 25 and just sexy movie star looks instead of like looking like fucking Ian Holm.
Well, that's what my first thought was, like, they're actors, not movie stars. But they don't look. They look like a group of
like
miners.
real people.
They look like they're working in space.
Truck drivers in space.
Yeah.
But I mean, and I think that's Ridley Scott said that's 50% of the job. And by casting like real actors in these roles, like that leaves him to work on the visuals and the pacing and all the other things that make this movie great, because he already cast great actors who, he still worked with the actors to get certain things out of their performances, but he didn't have to work as hard at that because they were already good at what they did.
Ridley Scott seems fun too, that he has like all of these other ideas, like while he's filming the movie, stuff that he's not even putting in the movie itself, but like kind of the opposite of actually what Dan O'Bannon kind of talked about, like, in the last episode we mentioned, like, he was just like, I don't give a shit where they come from or like whatever. Scott talks about like filming and having ideas that like there's these interpersonal relationships that they all have to, that he thinks they should kind of convey. Like, I think he even had at one point like a sex scene pitch from like Dallas and Ripley that they would have had a relationship. Like,
this is like a studio note.
What's that?
This is a note from the studios.
This was Scott saying like he actually like had thought of that. Like he
thought of that.
He thought of that like he wanted to show like some of the passing of the time, like some of the stuff later. And I think later in Prometheus, he kind of plays on that a little bit, like with the captain there. And anyway,
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyway,
the better
Prometheus.
Less said about Prometheus, the better.
But just that they'll pass the time. He says even, I mean, and I swear this is in the commentary, he says even like with Veronica Cartwright and Sigourney Weaver, that they'd like had like a deeper relationship, that he said that they even pitched like, that he was just saying like early on he had considered like maybe one of the first lesbian like couples or something, like just early on, or maybe they weren't even couples, but just that they were open to that kind of relationship when you spend like years in space.
7 people on a ship together for years, not a lot of options, man.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what he's saying. It's like just different ways they pass the time, basically.
Yeah. So as the film moved towards production, O'Bannon's influence on the project waned. Walter Hill had trimmed his script, even changed the names of some of the characters, changed most of the dialogue, and Ridley Scott was fine with those changes, but he still wanted O'Bannon to take another look. He still valued Dan O'Bannon's input. And O'Bannon said, quote, "So I went through and repaired some of the damage, but because I had been ordered not to go back to the original, some of the best moments were lost. It was a sad degrading of my screenplay. I was convinced the picture was ruined." Even at this point in time, before shootings are just about to begin, like Dan O'Bannon is still, and this is me being an armchair psychologist on this, but I think it's because of the way that he got screwed with John Carpenter that he's just overprotective of his work. I mean, honestly, if you're a screenwriter in Hollywood, that's the nature of the job.
Yeah, they tell any writing class that you sit in, it's like, look, when it comes to screenplays or comic book scripts or anything like that, it's a collaborative effort. Your final draft is probably going to change, and it's just the nature of it. It's not meant to be a personal attack, but it's those changes most of the time end up making it better.
I mean, some of the time.
Sometimes they make it
most of the time, and
sometimes they make them better. Sometimes it's better. Well, it's good to have that. It's good to have that objective third party to say, hey, this may not work. This one thing you've got here might not work. It might be better to change it to X. That's always good to have.
Yeah. It's always good to have other people, giving you notes or making suggestions. But I think he felt slighted. He felt like they were taking something he'd worked very hard on and turning it into something that he had never intended. So principal photography for Alien took place at Shepperton Studios near London from July to October of 1978. And O'Bannon was there. He hung around on set, getting into everyone's business and even sometimes giving orders because I guess he thought he was the director. He actually at first did not like the direction of the film. He had envisioned kind of a fast-paced comic book style, but Scott's style was more atmospheric and a slower, more methodical pace than kind of what O'Bannon had envisioned when he was writing the script. Sometimes they'd be watching dailies and he would yell, "Too slow." And Scott would have to like take him to the side and be like, "Hey, I appreciate the criticism, but that might be better if we were to do that in private instead of just screaming it out in the middle of dailies." Now, there are later interviews with O'Bannon where he says that, he was watching dailies and he started to see the movie come together and was happy with what he was seeing.
Yeah, it's just tough. You got to imagine that's just frustrating for Scott. Like I said, he was secretly had this desire to please O'Bannon, and there's just no pleasing O'Bannon.
There is no pleasing Dan O'Bannon. Dan O'Bannon, he would make suggestions and offer criticisms, none of which endeared him to Scott or anyone else on set, but it didn't get him kicked off. Like, they still let him hang around. What did get him kicked off of the set was when he thought that his typewriter had been stolen. So he had a secretary there, and he would dictate his thoughts to the secretary. She'd type them on his typewriter. When he went into his office one day and found his typewriter missing, and he got upset, and he stormed into a meeting between Scott and the producers, and he saw his typewriter in there in that meeting. And then in typical Dan O'Bannon fashion, he let his temper get the best of him. He flew into a rage about his stupid typewriter, and Scott told him to calm down. He's like, we just borrowed it, man. We're going to give it back. We just needed to use a typewriter. But O'Bannon was not easy to settle down once he got into a fury. And so a few days later, he got kicked off the set and was sent back to the U.S.
Wow. Jeez.
Yeah, he was hypercritical, on the set from everything I saw. And just, he defended a lot of aspects of the movie that would become the biggest parts of it. Like we talked about with the facehugger thing. He brought on Ron Cobb, who designed the interiors, that kind of thing. Had to, he was a big advocate for H.R. Giger's designs that were used and that whole thing. And, but he would nitpick a lot. Was their problem with him, and like Justin said, until he lost his temper with Scott was his biggest advocate, and finally lost his patience with him. They sent him on. Producers, none of them were big fans of him being on set at all. He had tried to after the first week of shooting, he was wanting to get copies of the dailies or view the dailies. And Gordon Carroll was the name I saw. Is
Gordon Carroll. He is part of the Brandywine Productions.
Right. He said he refused them. It was you're not getting these.
But O'Bannon got around that by going into the projectionist booth and watching the dailies on his own. And he's like, if they won't let me in there, I'll just go and watch them with the projector.
But those guys in Walter Hill and everything, they had no respect for O'Bannon. They ignored him and gave him no credit. After the movie became famous, they all were not fans. Scott still speaks fondly of him, but
Scott was a fan. But before he went home, though, O'Bannon did have one more crucial contribution to the film. So he was worried that Ridley Scott wasn't in tune with the horror of the day. Which he was right. Ridley Scott was not a horror guy. He was not a horror filmmaker. He wasn't a sci-fi filmmaker, but he felt that in order for Alien to be successful, it had to have some shock value. It had to have something to really get in the audience's face. So O'Bannon set up a screening of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I love how we're going full circle on this.
Yeah,
and he said to Scott, you're not going to like this film, but just see it. He's like, you just have to watch it. So Scott watched the film in a screening room on the Fox lot. Walter Hill joined him. Walter Hill actually walked into the screening room. He's like, hey, what you got going on here? What are you watching? And he's got a Coke and a cheeseburger. He's going to eat. And at the end of the movie, the two of them sat, they watched the whole movie. At the end of the movie, he had not touched his Coke, had not touched his cheeseburger. They were both entranced with this movie. And that kind of got Scott in, it kind of got him to think, we have to have that something that really just grabs the audience. So when it was over, Scott was ready to shoot that scene, that shocking scene in Alien, the biggest scene, the most well-known scene in Alien. And that was the chest burster scene.
Yeah. Scott says the thing that nailed me to a wall was Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was so shocking to me. The places they went that no one else had ever gone before. He said the things he remembers during that time were that movie, and he said the other film that he would give credit to is The Exorcist. He said he did see what Friedkin had done, and he thought he had nailed it too. He said to just take in just a mundane, unlikely scenario, and then making it like turn into this terrible like scenario, like just the whatever. He just thought these two films were like iconic, which they are. And
he was right.
It's just like he's like, it's kind of sad because he talks a little bit about it there. Just like, it's kind of sad because there's so many horror movies and people just settle for less. He's like, but you got to keep making movies, I guess. But he's like, those guys, there was real art there with what they were doing.
So in the script, the chestburster scene, all it said was like, this thing emerges. It didn't have any like big, it didn't have a lot of like detail on what the thing looked like or anything like that. And the cast, when they were filming it, they had no idea really how the scene was going to play out. And this was intentional. Like Scott wanted genuine terrified reactions from the cast. So they kind of got John Hurt set up separately. Everyone else was out of the room. They were away from the set. They put him in like an artificial chest. Like it's an effect that we've seen before, like on our Tom Savini series with the zombie movies, you know, where you've got an artificial chest and the real head and shoulders coming out. So they did that. And then they bring the cast in. The cast doesn't know what's going on. They don't know how the scene's going to play out. Cause again, the script is pretty vague about it. And the way the cast describes it is that they walk onto the set and John Hurt's laying there, you know, with it sticking out of the table. And the whole crew is in raincoats. Everyone's wearing raincoats. And then there's this horrible smell of formaldehyde in the room. We mentioned this earlier, maybe on our last, I think it was last week's episode. And instead of using prosthetic effects, because Scott was worried they would look too fake, because again, this is late 70s, you know, prosthetic effects aren't as advanced as they are now. They were using organs from a butcher's shop. So I think, Todd, you mentioned, you know, the face hugger later on when they examine it, and those were oysters. Well, they did that for like the innards for John Hurt, for the inside of the egg. You know, the egg when the face burster, the face hugger hits him. That was the inside of the egg was like a cow's stomach and tripe.
Yeah, it was like the lining of it. They called it the stitching or something like that.
Tripe is stomach lining.
Yeah, and then what came up out of the thing and hit him in the face was like an intestine.
It was a sheep's intestine. Yeah. So that the little thing that jumps out, and they used like an air cannon to basically shoot it out and then slowed it down and reversed it, and so that you could, because it was too fast when they originally filmed it. Wow. But yeah, so they're using, you know, obviously there are prosthetics, of the face hugger itself is like something they built, but they're using real organs and stuff. So they go into this room where they're using that for John Hurt's innards. And it just stinks because they've kept the stuff in formaldehyde, and it's just organ meat from the local butcher in London. So they start filming it. Again, the cast has no idea what's going on. The alien starts to come out. You can watch this footage, this behind the scenes footage. But the alien starts to come out, but it won't burst through the shirt. They can't get it to go through the shirt, so it's just like blood spatter. Oh. And then they tried it again, and when it does burst out, like nobody in the cast was really ready for it. And so the look you see on their faces of them just being shocked and terrified is real. That's real shock. That's what Scott wanted. He wanted a true reaction from them. And Veronica Cartwright, like she actually got like a spray of blood hit her in the face, and she actually like fainted. She passed out from the shock of it. Jeez. And her reaction is my favorite. I mean, the look on her face when that happens in the film is like, you can tell like she is truly like terrified for a moment.
She says like they went in there. She was like, we'll do it like a quick take. There's like 4 cameras. We'll just get this done. You'll probably get a little blood on you. She was like, we didn't even know what was happening. And she's like, they had a fucking jet pointed at my face. And Harry Dean Stanton is like there, and he says this, and I can believe 100% it's true, because I imagine Harry Dean Stanton just being high as fuck or something on set. He's just like, I thought it was real. I was like, what the fuck? Like, just real.
The movie filmed on 3 principal sets. There was the surface of the alien planetoid, the interiors of the Nostromo, and then the derelict spacecraft. And they created these 1/24th scale miniatures of the planetoid surface and the derelict spacecraft. Those were created by the art director, Les Dilley, based on H.R. Giger's designs. And then the art director would scale them up to be built out of wood and fiberglass on set. And then they brought in like tons of sand and plaster and fiberglass and rock and gravel into the studio. Because remember, this is at Shepperton Studios, not on any kind of location, to create the Planetoid's desert surface.
That Giger design for the ship was from Necronomicon. Scott says they found that in Necronomicon. He was like sitting on set.
The crescent moon shaped
Yeah,
ship.
yeah. He says he was just thumbing through, and there was like a picture in there that was like an instrument, like a musical instrument. Giger had drawn, and he just saw it as the ship, so like took it, in to get it mocked up and everything. I love too, by the way, just the idea of like when he's shooting that, he thought that the model that they made wouldn't hold up, and this is, since we're all about this crafty outside the box thinking like we were on Dark Star. I thought this was amazing. He said the model's not going to hold up to criticism like on the look of it. So he said he took a handheld camera, like just a standard handheld camera, and filmed the model like up close and like tried to make it wobbly and that sort of thing. And then he took that, it was shooting into the monitor, and then he filmed the monitor of him like filming the model, so that he could get the look of like through the helmets.
It's a cool shot.
Yeah, I know. I just thought that was amazing. I was like, he was like that. Just hearing him talk about that, I was like, that's fucking fantastic. I would never think of shit like that. I guess that's why he's Ridley Scott and I'm not.
And you're Gary Horne.
Yeah. But it's just
I really do love that shot. I have always loved that shot where it looks like you're looking at a television monitor, like footage of that. It just, there's something about it that feels very like found footagey,
Oh yeah, very much.
That I think is just really cool, And also when they did build like part of the exterior of the Nostromo like full size. They built like the like feet that it like lands on, and when they were filming it, Ridley Scott was not sure that it looked big enough. So we actually got his son and the son of the cinematographer to dress up in small spacesuits, like their size spacesuits, so that when you see the astronauts outside on the planet's surface, it's actually the children, because he wanted them to look smaller next to this giant thing. Same thing happens later on in the space jockey room. He did the same thing because he wanted the room to look bigger than it actually was. So he filmed children in their spacesuits.
Well, J.J. Abrams did the same thing in Star Trek in 2009.
Oh, yeah?
Mm-hmm. He shot, he had Kirk running away from a big alien chasing him on the snow. And when you see him from the back, it's a kid.
Huh.
Yeah. There's your Star Trek reference.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get into a discussion of Star Trek. I was about to ask a question about it. I was like, that'll take another 5 minutes.
No.
He gets banned from the planet, basically. It's where he meets Scotty. But no, I mean, Spielberg does, he uses a little person in the shark cage, like a smaller shark cage with a little person in it with the...
Well, that's because they were using a normal shark
footage.
and not a 2,000-pound great white in that scene.
Right, yeah.
But yes, same concept. So eventually Giger himself would also be a fixture on the set. He was no longer content to just simply mail in images of his artwork and get them stopped at customs at LAX or in London at this point. He actually showed up. They had him working on set. He physically sculpted and painted sets for the film, like the space jockey room. He carved and airbrushed the space jockey himself and airbrushed by hand that entire room himself. So essentially that set was one giant piece of Giger artwork created by him, which is crazy.
Yeah.
It's insane to think about.
Did any of the pieces of the set survive?
I doubt it. They were like fiberglass and stuff, so I don't know that they would have held up. I'm not really sure though. Yeah, they should be in a museum somewhere. In the Smithsonian.
To his credit, to like for what hopefully Scott watched the 2003 commentary for the film. O'Bannon does in there talk about one of the great parts about it, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, was that the atmosphere that Scott was creating. O'Bannon talks about like this guy's a master at that. And he says a horror movie without atmosphere isn't pleasing to watch. And Ridley Scott is a master of atmosphere. And he says he talks about in there that he remembers seeing Scott walking around the set He had people with incense burners like going off because he wanted to fill the area with a fog. And just to make the thick air, he said that Scott was like walking around himself with a piece of cardboard, like fanning it, to try to make the room thick. And they said he didn't even understand what he was doing at the time. But then Scott started like clipping little lights in certain areas and then filtering it with like this blue-gray thing that he would put in front of it. And he said that the result was like the color of a Giger painting. He's like, wow. he thought it was magnificent, that he just would have never thought of that stuff himself.
Ridley Scott is, like I said, I'm hit or miss on some of his films, but I think he is an incredible visual stylist. I've always thought that. And I think this is, incredible work that he's doing here because he just knew how to do it. And the thing is, he shot most of this movie. His director of photography on this is Derek Van Lent, who is the credited cinematographer on this, but truly like Ridley Scott was handling the camera himself for a lot of this film. There are some a lot of static shots, close up, things like that Van Lent would shoot, but Ridley Scott, he wanted this kind of handheld look to a lot of the movie, which I think adds another level of kind of reality to it. There's a lot of handheld camera work in this, and in those scenes, like Ridley Scott's got the camera on his shoulder. He's the one physically shooting that. Even though he's not the credited director of photography, he was essentially a co-director of photography because he's shooting it all himself. And he's very meticulous about how things look. And I think adding that bit of like fog, that bit of haze to the set adds a lot to it, because when you see light shine through it, it has a certain effect to it, but it also kind of covers up the limitations of some of the sets, because this movie was $10 million. It started out as like 4.2 or something like that. And then Ridley Scott, who makes these meticulous storyboards, he drew out storyboards for the entire film. And when he showed those to executives at 20th Century Fox, they doubled his budget because they really saw how much potential this had. But even so, $10 million for a space set movie, even in 1979, was fairly low budget. It was a significant budget for what they were trying to do, but it wasn't like this wasn't Star Wars, and they were building sets out of like pieces of, airplanes and things like that, and tubing, and they were assembling this out of junk essentially and trying to make it look like something else. Yeah. And I don't know, I think it's really cool the way that they got around that. And I think it adds a lot of texture to the movie.
Oh, for sure.
Even, Gary mentioned earlier how they Ron Cobb, I guess his original design of the interior of the spaceship was more like straight lines and stuff. They turned it into curving corridors, a lot of corners and things like that. Mm-hmm. Well, when they built that set, it was all one piece. It was like you walked into these tunnels and you got lost. You could get lost in there because it's all like those it's not like they're filming the same corner over and over. Like they built the interior of the spaceship. Jeez. So actors would talk about like going in, they would get turned around and get lost in there. When you walked into that set, you were there and there was like no way out. It was claustrophobic.
Oh boy. Talk about creating an atmosphere.
Yeah.
Another person that was on the set there that he wasn't, I think he was uncredited, I'm pretty sure, but Scott brought in Anton Furst, who ends up doing like production design on Batman 89 and Full Metal Jacket. He was on the set of Alien, like helping out. His big creation was the whole egg layer for that area. Like he created that. And he and Scott envisioned that like the placenta over the eggs was that layer of fog and light that you see that like Hurt falls through at one point. He's like looking down through. They did that because like the Who was working on a stage show next door.
Yeah. They borrowed their lasers.
So they borrowed their lasers.
Nice.
And came through. That was Anton Furst, like went and got him and brought him over. They set that up. And yeah, that was just cool, man. It's so cool, like even seeing this stuff, like for instance with the eggs and weird things you would not notice, like for instance, like when Hurt disturbs the egg the first time, if you look at it and you go back and see it, I've seen this movie like 5 times in the past week, but the water is going upwards on the egg, like the droplets are going up towards the opening. It's because the egg's actually hanging upside down technically, but it's just to make it eerie and weird. And,
just to make it a little extra weird.
And inside it's like a fiberglass egg, but when you see like the inside, it like lights up when he's shining on it. You can see the face hugger in there. That's Ridley Scott's hand inside of it with a rubber glove, like moving his hand around.
Well, that was a pickup shot after production that they decided they wanted to show the egg, and they built this clear fiberglass egg, and Ridley Scott just put on like rubber gloves and was flapping them back and forth, like, you know, to make it look like that. But you would, and even knowing that, when I watched that scene in the movie, it doesn't look like hands. I can't tell.
You can't tell.
Yeah. No.
And he says also the egg opening was hydraulic and made with like metal and tension, and like it opened up. He's like, but seriously, he's like, that would take your fucking hand off.
Yeah,
he's like, it was. He's like, that was legit.
When Giger was designing those eggs, he originally had it as just like a single opening and it looked like a vagina, and they're like, we can't do that. Like, we got to show this place. We got to show this in places where, like, Catholic countries, they're not going to let us show this if it's just a vagina opening. And he's probably thinking, well, what about the giant dick on the head of the main monster of the movie? But what he ended up doing is he turned it into a cross. So it's basically a cross-shaped vagina on top of the eggs. And Giger, according to Giger, he says that he purposely did that. He's like, well, now it's double obscene.
Well, no, but I was gonna say, I mean, 100%. The more you hear Ridley Scott talk about this movie, he's fucking like, he's just as much of a perv. Like he tried his hardest. He talks about it. He tried his hardest to get everybody naked in the opening scene. Like, they were going to wake up and be everybody's butt ass naked. And then, like, they were like, no way, can't do that. Then he's like, well, at least everybody's topless. And they're like, no, come on. Like, he's like, well, we'll tape their nipples. They're like, you got to have shirts on. We're losing like 5 countries if you don't put fucking shirts on these people. And so it's just like constant. And like, he straight up, I mean, he straight up talks about with Ash, and like his interaction with Ripley, like where he pins her down and like shoves the magazine in her mouth. He's just like, he's getting off on this. This is him. Yeah. Like, he's just like, he's always wanted to shove something in her mouth, and like, he just doesn't have the tool. So he's going to use this magazine. And that's Ridley Scott talking. So like, I don't know. I saw articles where people like tried to say like, when Ash blew up, you know, it's all white and all the white liquid coming out of him. Yeah. That's intentional. And I don't know.
I think it is intentional.
I was about to say, after seeing many interviews with Ridley Scott, I'm like, yeah, probably. Like, that just seems like Ridley Scott. He's the one hinting at lesbian relationships between Cartwright and Sigourney Weaver. And like, he also wanted to film the sex scene with Dallas, and like, oh, Scott, you're a hornball too.
Well, that scene with Ash, like the way they shot that is, you know, it's kind of like, it's fun. It's kind of like a lo-fi, you know, we mentioned it earlier, but the inside of his like android, the parts you see on the table really was just like fiberglass, like little marbles and pieces of like fiber optic and stuff like that. It's nothing like super fancy. And then they just covered it in like white milk, you know? I mean, there is an animatronic Ash that you see in like one shot, but it's kind of, as Ridley Scott would put it, he calls it a little dodgy. That's the word that he calls it. A little dodgy. Same thing when you see the Ash without the head, that the arms are kind of flapping. It's like, yeah, the arms are a little dodgy, but it works. I mean, and the effect is very simple. Of course, Ian Holmes' head is through a table, and they put the skin flaps where his neck is, and then change his voice. It's simple, but it's so effective. Yeah. And it's just, yeah, it really is very, his whole reveal, I think, is very well done, where you just see that trickle of the milk on his forehead coming down. And as an audience member, if you've never seen the movie before, you're like, what the fuck is going on? What's coming down off his head? And it's not until I think it's Yaphet Kotto Parker that hits him in the head, and his head comes off, and that you realize, oh shit, like, there's nothing at all that indicates that he's a robot before that. But once that happens, it really pulls the rug out from under the audience. And of course, that would become a staple in the entire franchise later on.
Well, it's interesting too. Like, I mean, I think I mentioned it for the last episode, but just that, even with that, just the outside the box thinking that Scott was like, we're not going to be able to out technology this. Like, what's a robot look like? What's a cyborg, the humanoid thing look like inside? And he's just like, well, we just fill it with literal like caviar, I think is in there too, and stuff like that. And so he's just like, we fill it all with this. And then you're just like, well, this is more technologically advanced than anything we would understand.
It's so far advanced that we wouldn't recognize it as technology.
Yeah, it just doesn't even look, we can't explain that. So,
yeah.
And then that works better than them trying to do like circuits and wires and stuff.
I agree. And it was not an easy, set to be on. You've got these spacesuits like that they were wearing. They were huge and thick and bulky, and they initially had no venting in them. I mean, you think Dan O'Bannon could have been like, hey, we kind of ran into this issue on Dark Star, but you got to let your actors breathe when they're wearing spaceships. So they would just be breathing in their own carbon dioxide. And they actually had to keep nurses on hand with oxygen tanks in case the actors were to pass out. Same thing happened with the kids. When they had the kids in the little tiny spacesuits, the kids were almost passing out until they inserted like a venting system into the spacesuits.
Wow.
So not an easy film to work on.
They figured out the ventilation with the kids.
Yeah, they figured it out. The film was edited by Terry. What?
I said, then it mattered more.
So the film was edited by Terry Rollins. Terry Rollins had been Scott's editor on The Duelist, and he and Scott intentionally left the pace kind of slow in order to build suspense for the scary scenes. And I think that's essential to the film's success. I don't think this is a slow movie in that it's boring at all. There's nothing boring about this movie, but I think that it is methodically paced to where the suspense builds as the movie goes. It gets more and more intense as it goes until by the final act, the tension is just unbearable, and I think part of that is also that Scott shows us very little of the final alien form. I think that is a very good decision on his part, because early in the film, you see the face hugger and you see the chest burster in very bright light, harsh bright lighting. You get a really good look at both of them, and that's kind of a tease because you think that Scott's going to do that with the final form, with what would later be known as the xenomorph. You think he's going to show us that in full light or a good shot of it, and he never does. He never gives us a really good shot of the final alien. And by doing that, I think Scott keeps the audience wondering. He keeps us in suspense. He knows that our imagination is going to scare us more than anything he could show us. Because again, this movie shares a lot of DNA with Lovecraft, that fear of the unknown, that unknowable evil. Oh, yeah. And I think by not showing the alien that much, it really plays into the psychology of the audience.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and from a production standpoint, it's probably a little bit better because didn't Spielberg do that with Jaws? Like,
Spielberg did with Jaws.
Some of it was out of necessity,
but yes,
but
yes, it worked very well.
But it worked very well. Yeah.
So the original assembly cut for Alien was over 3 hours long. It was edited down to a final cut of just under 2 hours. One scene that was cut, Dallas and Brett are discovered by Ripley as she's about to escape the Nostromo. They're thought to be dead, but they've actually been cocooned by the alien. So O'Bannon had actually included this scene in his screenplay to indicate that Brett was becoming an alien egg, actually growing like a new face hugger inside of them. Ugh. Then Dallas was going to be implanted by the resulting face hugger to grow a whole new alien. And the scene was cut out for a couple of reasons. One, Scott was unhappy with the effects. He didn't think they would look realistic enough, but also because it slowed down the pace of the finale. Tom Skerritt would later say, he said, quote, the picture had to have that pace. Her trying to get the hell out of there. We're all rooting for her to get out of there. And for her to slow up and have a conversation with Dallas was not appropriate, which I agree with, because at that point in the film, you want her to keep moving. But yeah, a shortened version of that scene was reinserted into Ridley Scott's 2003 director's cut. So let's talk about the director's cut for a second. Because Gary, did you watch this version? I know we talked about it. You watched the director's cut? You watched both versions.
I watched both versions, yeah.
So the director's cut is not really a director's cut. So in 2003, 20th Century Fox was preparing the Alien quadrilogy DVD box set, and they wanted to include alternate versions of all 4 films, director's cuts or alternate cuts of all 4 films. This is where the famous assembly cut of David Fincher's Alien 3 comes from. So they asked Ridley Scott to remaster Alien and create a director's cut. Now, there's no indication that the theatrical cut of Alien was not Ridley Scott's preferred version. That essentially was his director's cut. But even Scott says that the version that was in this Alien quadrilogy box set was just called a director's cut for marketing purposes, because that's what was being done in the early 2000s. You had all these director's cuts and special editions coming out, and that was a selling point to a lot of people. So studios kept doing it, even when this was not necessarily the preferred version of the film by the directors.
Yeah, it's like you see this a lot of times, even now, like you said, but Ridley Scott straight up, like in the box set, multiple times, even in the accompanying booklets, the commentary, I believe even in the intro to the special edition or the director's cut, that he says there is no director's cut of this movie. He was happy with the film as it was. He got to do what he wanted to do. He said by 2003, there were things that, after you've seen the movie for a quarter of a century, there's things you could tweak. Sure. There had been scenes that people had seen on deleted scenes that fans had requested be added back in. And so he thought there were ways he could modify those and get them back in there. And so he decided to do it just to work with it, But,
yeah, I mean, it's an alternate version of the movie. It's got alternate scenes. It's actually like a minute shorter, I think, than the theatrical cut. But it gave fans a chance to see some material that they had not seen before reinserted into the film. And even though it's not necessarily like the Ridley Scott's like final version of the film, but his version of the film is the one that came out in theaters in 1979, as opposed to something like Blade Runner, that's got like 4 different versions, and the version that came out in theaters was definitely not Ridley Scott's version.
Or even I've been watching through them, and like Aliens. I mean, even that one, the director's cut of Aliens is, I think, James Cameron's preferred version of Aliens. Yeah. Like the sequel, just he thought they had, the tendency was to cut movies down, and he had wanted his version to be longer, and they had made, argued with him to trim it down. So even in that one, it is the preferred version. But in Alien, it's Ridley Scott's pretty straightforward about he had no changes he wanted to make.
Yeah. I actually saw the director's cut on the big screen. It came out on Halloween of 2003. Before the DVD box set came out, they actually re-released it to theaters, and I had a chance to see it. It's actually the first and only time I've been able to see Alien on the big screen. So I've actually never seen the original theatrical cut on the big screen, which I would love to do.
That's cool. Well, I watched the original cut. I actually have the big box set, and a friend of mine.
Yeah, that's the one we're talking about, the quadrilogy.
Yeah, I've got the quadrilogy box set, and a friend of mine has an office space at a local mill here, and a big white wall. And so he brought a projector and threw it up on the wall. So we were watching it, and probably 10 or 12 feet wide. And
nice.
It's not in the theater, but pretty close. And it was a lot of we had
right now.
Yeah, and we had a lot of fun. It was a really great because I think one of our friends that we were with hadn't ever seen that before.
Oh, wow.
So it was a fun viewing experience. We had a good time.
The film was released on May 25th, 1979. It was a box office hit, broke records left and right, eventually grossing $143 million worldwide. But critical reception was actually initially mixed, believe it or not. At the time, a lot of critics weren't very kind to sci-fi movies, and this was no exception. But of course, now it's considered one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made, one of the greatest horror movies ever made. Even critics who gave it mixed or negative reviews upon its original release, guys like Leonard Maltin and Roger Ebert, later came to reassess it and recognize its greatness. I think Roger Ebert even did one of his great movies columns on Alien later on.
Wow.
But not everyone has probably reassessed this movie and seen it for the incredible piece of filmmaking that it is. And I'm willing to bet if you were to, scour the internet, the deepest, darkest corners of the internet, you might find some people who have some unkind things to say about Alien.
My first one that I ran across was Pauline Kael's review of it. And
Wait.
No, Pauline Kael was very nice. I just thought it was interesting. I thought this would be fun to throw in here. She says, a quote from her review is, "It reached out, grabbed you, squeezed your stomach. It's more gripping than entertaining, but a lot of people didn't mind. They thought it was terrific because at least they'd felt something. They'd been brutalized."
Wow.
And I thought that was an interesting thing from Pauline Kael. But yeah, there's some people that apparently were not huge fans of Alien and decided they needed to get online and type something up real quick because, as it turns out, with most people on the internet, somebody needs a nap. This first review is, I don't know, I can catch the name. It's 1 out of 5 stars. They said, subject is, "I'd rather not." And and the review is, "Wow, what was all the hubbub about this movie? No thanks."
That's it.
That's the review.
That's their assessment.
And I just found it fun. Let's see here. This is from Zombageddon. 1 star. "Completely overrated. I felt nothing for these characters. The acting was plain bad, and they kept making one bad Alien movie after another with the exact same redundant plot line. I really hope they don't make any more Alien movies. It's becoming an awful franchise like Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm glad they went in a new direction with Prometheus, which is a much better film than all of the Alien movies combined." That was for Justin.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Justin, you doing okay, buddy?
My head hurts.
I saw that.
Was that a real one? Was that a real review?
That's 100% a real review, and I saw it and was like, "That's going in. That's going in." Prometheus is a better movie than all of the Alien movies combined.
Let's get that cross stitched on something and get.
Oh man. Let's see. This is from Saint Just, so I'm going to assume this is Justin Bishop. Saint Justin.
Yeah.
What do people see in this film? Is the title of this review, and immediately that's the first line of the review. What do people see in this film? I am not one for horror films, though I do like this alien stuff. Nothing happens in this film. Nothing. We spent most of the time waiting and waiting for something to happen. The movie could have been cut to half an hour easy. There is a saying that says that fear is being scared of the unknown, something that the X-Files has done really well. Unfortunately, this film has tried to do this too, and it's gone too far. Rather than waiting for something to happen while on the edge of our seats, we wait and wait and wait and wait and wait. We barely get to see the alien, and the special effects are pretty poor. Sure, it was a long time ago, so we can't expect too much, but look at Star Wars, which came out around the same time. They were much better than Alien, and Lucas had half the money. Alien is simply a boring movie that deserves no credit.
Whoa.
That guy thinks that Star Wars was made for $5 million.
Yeah, I think so. This is from Maz. Who says, "Fear in its purest form." 1 star. Ridley Scott has created only the truest form of fear in the movie history. This film shows what if you were in space alone. No one can hear you. No one can save you. You are stuck with a monster tormenting you, knowing that you have no chance. It's hard to know that there is someone out for your blood, but for it to possibly be in the next room with nowhere else for you to go, you can make one wrong move, resulting in yours and possibly your crew's death. How would you like that? That's why this remains only one of the scariest sci-fi movies ever made, because in space, no one can hear you scream.
Wait, that's a good review. That's a positive review.
It felt like a Todd review. Because it 100% is a 1-star review. They gave it 1 star.
That's a very positive.
Said that.
Wow. The whole thing, the whole time I'm listening, going, yeah, all right, yeah, sure. Come on, boy. Yeah,
right.
Start. Yeah, okay.
All right. Real quick, Lids. This is from Harry Plinkett. It says, Twisted. Scott is a lousy director, a great visual artist, but not good at directing. Giger is a degenerate who painted monsters and hellish images all his life, and the whole horror genre is, by and large, a pit of degeneracy. This film is an effective horror and does impress visually in many ways. It also has a memorable soundtrack, but at the end of the day, it is just nasty. And I am sick and tired of nasty imagery poisoning my mind. Shove it in the toilet.
Wow.
That is Harry Plinkett. And finally,
did it have a memorable soundtrack?
I mean, I thought the score was good.
I mean, it was a score, but I wouldn't say it was.
I mean, there were no like needle drops.
Yeah. Okay. To, like, all right.
Bits in Arizona at any point.
Did I miss something?
And this final review had no name on it, but it is 1 out of 5 stars. It says, space robots think they're above space law, and Sigourney Weaver has mother issues.
What? That's the whole review?
That's the review.
Wow.
And that has been Somebody Needs a Nap.
Wow. It sure has. Well, regardless of what these folks think, I think Alien is, in my opinion, one of the few like perfect movies. Like this, everything about this movie, every element, it's one of the few times where everything like comes together and just works well together, like perfectly. You've got O'Bannon's story. It's ingenious in its simplicity. I think Walter Hill, I mean, I know O'Bannon likes to paint him as the bad guy, but I think him punching up the dialogue gives the film like a realness and a naturalness that's lacking in a lot of sci-fi movies, especially ones that were released before this.
And O'Bannon said that he had a conversation with Hill where Hill said that he thought the whole point of this movie is evil corporations. They created this whole situation. Had they not been greedy and needed to be involved in everything, they would not have interfered and like found the alien, blah, 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 blah. Which, side note, I think is a possible, I mean, it's a thing in this movie.
I mean, it's the thing that the entire rest of the franchise is completely based on.
Right, exactly. If they'd left well enough alone. O'Bannon, to his credit, giving props to Walter Hill, said he did say to Hill, "You're absolutely right." And you can imagine how I feel now butting up against a producer who thinks he's a writer.
Wow. Woo. Man, wow. Well, anyway, you've also got, Ridley Scott's visual artistry, which elevates the movie above its kind of intended B-movie origins. And then, of course, the design from H.R. Giger, which is completely iconic and one of the all-time great movie monsters. I think if any one of these elements hadn't been there, it wouldn't be the same movie. Even if like Hill had not come in and rewritten O'Bannon's script, it would not be the movie that we got. This is like lightning in a bottle. This is every single element coming together. If someone else had directed it, if they'd have brought in a different writer to rewrite O'Bannon's script, if they'd have brought in, if the studio had refused to use H.R. Giger's designs, if any of these things had not been there, Alien as we know it would not be, I think, the iconic movie that it is. But it's just one of those few times where every single element works in the film's favor. The cast, the music, the visuals, the story, every single thing works perfectly in sync.
For the collaborative effort of the thing. I mean, it's all these people coming together that are so talented, that are so great at what they do. It's like you said. I mean, it's lightning in a bottle. It's just from the simplest moments to the greatest moments of the movie. It's just like everybody, the thought that was put into all of it. I don't know, man. I think back on there's so many fun stories for this movie. We can't get to everything, but just like the idea that like O'Bannon, another thing he pitched to Cobb and Scott during the time was like the way that the seats wobbled when they landed the ship. Like just that little detail I think is really cool. He's like, I was on a plane and I'm landing and I'm like, the turbulence hits you and this plane feels like it's going to fucking fall apart. And he's like, and then I'm watching like, we're doing Alien and I'm thinking of like every space movie just has the fucking ship just like land, like doop, there you are, you're there, everything's fine. And I'm like, nah, man, like what if it's not that way? What if you're not sure that every time you take a landing on some weird planet that maybe your whole fucking ship's gonna fall apart? Yeah, right. He's like, so there's like that whole thing. And I don't know, Scott, going into detail about the title sequences. Like you had the graphic designers that worked on the posters and the press work and stuff. Just like that title sequence that I think is still one of the most epic title sequences that's ever happened. Just like that, it's like these weird. It almost starts off as like hieroglyphs and stuff, and that was the idea, was that it was to be there because Scott had, say what you will about the movies that have come out since, but Scott had these ideas back at this movie of like what this all was. Where are these aliens from? Those questions, like what's the space jockey? What's this? Where does it come from? He wanted to explore all that. It wasn't, I don't know, you can say it's good or bad, but the guy was interested in that stuff day one. He was, and so the hieroglyphs for him hinted that there was like this civilization before.
I like the idea of like throwing those hints in there, but I think that they made the right decision in not trying to explore that too much in this movie, because of course this movie, as we all know, it produced a lot of sequels and spinoffs and whatnot. And we'll discuss James Cameron's Aliens at some point down the road. And it's definitely the best of the sequels, I think, but the rest of which range from just okay to downright terrible. But one of the things that the sequels do, including Cameron's, is they give us a lot more info about the aliens, about their origins, about their life cycle. But here, Scott and O'Bannon and Shusett, they knew that the less info that they gave, the better. It makes the alien scarier because we know so little about it. And this is kind of the Lovecraft angle again. It's just what we can imagine is so much scarier than what they could give us. That's why I think some of the sequels don't work. That's why I think Prometheus and Alien Covenant don't work, is because they're taking away the mystery and therefore taking away what makes the alien so scary.
Well, it's even back to that review where it talks about like nothing happens, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I mean, the alien and the facehugger each probably get about 4 minutes of screen time, I think I saw somewhere. So, that's all you get out of them. But I mean, Scott responds to criticism like of nothing happening for like the alien doesn't show up for like an hour into the movie. And and Scott responds to that with like, that's the point. Nothing happens for like 45 minutes because I want you to see the world that these workers function in. Yeah. It's a mining ship or refinery or some kind of freighter, and they're just waking up for some reason, and their day to day is fucking nothing. Yeah. And it's just standard day to day work practice. That's why it's so fucked up when all of a sudden there's a monster on the ship.
Right.
So why they might be surprised by that.
Yeah. So let's talk a minute. Well, we've already gotten, I think we've got a good idea of where Todd stands on this one, but sure. Let's hear Todd's take.
I hesitate to call any movie perfect, but if you are gonna use that, this is a good one to use it on. I mean, we've already described certain aspects of the movie as iconic. I think the movie as a whole is iconic. It's just everything from everything Gary just said, from the title sequences to the feel of the sets, to the casting, to the prosthetics, to the design, everything. It's one of those rare moments where the report card on this is nothing but A pluses. And I was because it's been a while since I've sat and watched this one. I'm a big fan of the second one, and it does tend to watch a little more like an action movie. And
definitely. Yeah.
And we'll get into that later, I'm sure. But I recall this one being a little bit, I don't want to call it slow, but more deliberately paced. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if this would have the same punch, this time around. And I was sucked in. I was from the first frame. I was sucked in immediately. In fact, I think at one point, my wife and the other couple we were watching it with, I think a few sentences of discussion were had, I was completely engrossed in what was going on. I was just, every performance, every turn, every glance from every member of the cast, every drip of KY coming off of that alien. I really dug it. I mean, I'm a sci-fi guy anyway, but this is such an interesting exploration.
You're a horror guy.
Hold on. I'm a big sci-fi guy anyway, but this is such an interesting exploration in a particular vein of the everyman horror sci-fi. Like the Venn diagram on this thing is really fascinating, and it's just so good. I really enjoyed it, and it makes me want to, when we're done recording, go watch the other three.
Yeah, I watched all 4 of the originals a couple months ago. Actually, I just got on a kick and watched them all. I like them all to varying degrees. Of those first 4, Alien 3 being my least favorite. I actually am in the minority of liking Alien Resurrection more than Alien 3. I like Alien Resurrection. I think it's silly and fun, but the through line through all of those, of course, is Sigourney Weaver. And here, this is when you watch Sigourney Weaver in this one, you're seeing a movie star being born. Like, it's not often that you can point to a movie and go, this is where that person became a movie star. And this is it. I mean, Ripley is one of the great screen heroes, action hero, horror heroes, whatever you want to call it. One of the first female action heroes. And I'm not sure that how much intention there was there, because obviously this was not written as a woman initially, but the way the character is, regardless of how it's written, by casting Sigourney Weaver in the role, it kind of becomes a feminist film. And I have to think that Ridley Scott at least was doing that intentionally, because if you read the script or you watch the movie, the men on the Nostromo are pretty fucking useless. Like they just make a series of bad decisions. Had they listened to Ripley, most of them would have probably been okay. Maybe not Kane, but the rest of them probably would have been okay if they had just listened to Ripley when she tried to keep them off the ship, she tried to keep them from bringing this thing on the ship. It would have been a much more boring movie, but everyone would have lived.
To jump ahead to something that we normally do, and the reason I want to do this is just because I want to get this out there before I forget about it. I actually just finished reading their William Gibson's unproduced script for Alien 3 was given over to IDW some years ago and turned into a miniseries, a graphic novel. And I just finished reading it. And if you dig the first one, watch the second one, and then go read William Gibson's Aliens 3. It is a comic. It is a comic. It's only 5 or 6 issues, but I mean, you can find it on Comixology. It is worth a read in light of the first 2, because this was written as a direct response, a direct continuation of Alien and Aliens. So if you're not a fan of Aliens 3 as it is on screen, you may want to check out William Gibson's unproduced Aliens 3 script by IDW. It's worth a read.
Okay, cool. Is there a trade version out yet?
Yes, there is a trade version. That's how I read it.
Okay.
And it's all together, and there's some sketches in the back, so you get a little bit of bonus content and seeing how they put everything together. It's worth a couple bucks. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So this movie, by the way, it passes that Bechdel test. You know what I'm saying?
The Bechdel test. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think even the column that it came from originally, Alison Bechdel wrote, like, Dykes to Watch Out For was her column, and that was where it was first proposed. Like, the character in the column, like, it talks about a movie that treats its female characters as equals, and the rule is 3 parts. Has to have at least 2 female characters who, number 2, have a conversation with each other. That, number 3, isn't about one of the male characters in the film. And so that became the Bechdel test. But the character in the column says that the last movie they remember seeing that fit that criteria was Alien. So anyway, that's
awesome.
Yeah. So this is this passes that test. So just for props there. Also worth mentioning, two things I found interesting. One, at the premiere of the movie, religious folk were very upset. There was a big prop of the xenomorph outside, and they set fire to it.
What?
Because they believed it was the work of the devil.
I think it was Jewish rabbis that did that.
Oh, maybe it was Jewish rabbis.
Really?
Either way,
Yeah.
that marks successful. That marks a successful film to me.
Yeah, when you make the church people angry,
Yeah.
you're doing it right.
Also, ridiculously, and I know that we have more familiarity with this, but I didn't realize it even started with Alien. But after the success that Star Wars was having with action figures, Kidder made an Alien toy after this movie for Christmas of 1979. It was like an 18-inch like alien, like xenomorph. It didn't have like the crew or any of that stuff, but it was the straight up like Giger xenomorph design, and it was apparently pretty breakable. So parents complained, and it got pulled. And it's like, I mean, it goes for like box versions of it go for like $1,000 now. But
Jeez.
Yeah, I mean, that was a thing in the 80s and 90s, you know, because I remember buying RoboCop toys and Terminator 2 toys, and those are definitely not kids' movies, you know. So,
well, I feel like I read somewhere
then.
this was like the first where they took like a rated R movie and started making toys out of it.
Yeah, I mean, that which is so weird about this movie, because there's a ton of sexual imagery in this movie, you know. I mean, it's that toy is of the xenomorph, the alien is, again, it's a big dick. I mean, the Giger stuff is pretty obvious, but then you've got scenes like the one Gary mentioned earlier where Ash tries to choke Ripley with a rolled up newspaper, you know, like that's a very like psychosexual image there. Or the fact that Ash is covered with a thick white liquid, you know, like
right.
I think that was fully intentional. And I mean, hell, the alien itself is covered with lube. The whole movie, the entire movie is covered with KY jelly. And then to take it even further, the like sexual imagery of the film, the movie kind of it shows what happens when a man is the victim of non-consensual sex. That's what the face hugger is. I mean, this was actually intentional on Dan O'Bannon's part, because he wanted to kind of subvert the rape revenge movies that were popular at the time. Stuff like I Spit on Your Grave and They Call Her One Eye movies, you know, that, like we've talked about before. He was kind of trying to do something else by showing the man as the victim, because again, he wanted to make the men in the audience feel very uncomfortable. But
I saw stories like during the early development of that O'Bannon and Shusett, when they were working on this, they said they came to like an impasse of like, how does the alien get aboard the ship? That was like the discussion they were trying to answer. And Shusett had come up with the idea, and maybe even as a joke, said the alien fucks one of them. Yeah. And so that eventually they worked that into the facehugger concept. And then O'Bannon had the idea of like, well, now we try to take the image of like a man getting raped and impregnated, and that so they became very adamant that the first victim has to be a man to like take from that horror cliche of the woman victim, you know. So that was very much part of that discussion.
Wow.
I mean, Dan O'Bannon, despite the fact that there were a lot of changes made to his script, that doesn't discount his significant contributions to the film. I mean, again, this was his story. It was his concept. It was his screenplay originally. It was him that came up with the chest burster scene, and Alien would not be Alien without the chest burster scene. And it was him that got H.R. Giger involved, and Alien would not be Alien without H.R. Giger's designs. But Dan O'Bannon never really received the credit he deserved. I mean, even critics who liked the film when it came out knocked the screenplay for being too thin. I would argue that its simplicity is actually one of its strengths, but at the time, people were saying that it was too thinly written, which I think that that's completely wrong. I think you get to know the characters very well enough because of the performances and what you get from them to care about whether or not they live or die, which I think is what you need out of a horror movie.
It's so crazy to me to think that that's like, I don't know, because I was reading this whole article about too, how, like producers, that's not even what they're looking at most of the time. Well, like they have professional readers that like tell them what a movie is sometimes because they get so many screenplays, right? Or at least during this time, this is how it was. And so the reason I had found it because it was the readers would generally find like, what's the easy way to explain this movie? And so for this one, it was
the elevator pitch.
Yeah, like the elevator pitch. But like for this one, it was like the summary for everybody was it's Jaws, but in space.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And
so,
David Giler, he who produced and co-wrote the screenplay with Walter Hill, he even diminished O'Bannon's contributions in the press after the film came out. Even if you watch him in interviews like the Beast Within documentary, which me and Gary I think both watched, that's on some of the special features on the Blu-ray and DVD. David Giler's kind of a dick, honestly, but he really kind of underplays how much O'Bannon contributed to this. When if it had not been for O'Bannon, you guys wouldn't have got a script on your desk in the first place. That was his script. You guys rewrote his script, but you wouldn't have had anything to rewrite without him. So that I think that's a dick move, to be honest. And the studio even took O'Bannon and Shuset's name off of the poster at first, but then they were forced to put it on after arbitration with the Writers Guild. But they even tried to take their name off, even though they were given screenplay credit. And the bad press over this dispute and the fact that O'Bannon didn't show up in the film's promotion definitely hurt his career. Like he was not being well associated with this film. And it hurt his career, and it also meant that he wasn't invited back to work on the sequels. So then, going back to O'Bannon's feud with his old pal John Carpenter, John Carpenter told the press that O'Bannon had just ripped off The Terror from Beyond Space. He called Alien stylish, but more repulsive than scary. And O'Bannon then, of course, he bashed Halloween. He said, quote, "You can make that in a weekend with some teenagers. It's kind of nifty in a minor key. Halloween is okay."
You sons of bitch. Well, you guys, it's too late to kiss and make up now, but God, that's so wrong.
It's a feud. They're feuding.
Oh, I hate it.
So what's ironic here is that those two films, though, Halloween and Alien, are very similar, honestly. They're both about this relentless killer that sort of represents evil personified. They don't have any motivation. Michael Myers in the first Halloween, which we will definitely cover on the show one day. We covered it on our old show if you want to hear our thoughts on it, but we'll cover it in more detail one day. But Michael Myers has no real reason for stalking the girls that he's stalking in the first Halloween movie. They're just there. And the same thing with this movie. Kane happens along, messes with an egg, and he's just in the wrong place at the wrong time, which fucks things for everyone else on the Nostromo. It's not because they were being hunted or the alien, they have something that the alien wants. It's just what the alien does. The alien kills. It's what Michael Myers does. He just kills. So
it's nature. It's nature. Yeah. It's killing indiscriminately.
Yeah, that's just what they do. So it's kind of ironic that they were kind of feuding in the press over these two movies when in reality, the movies are very, very similar.
And very, very good. Both of them.
They're both really good. They're both great movies. So it's unfortunate that despite creating one of the most iconic screen monsters of all time, Dan O'Bannon never really got his due, even from Alien, the movie that he's most well associated with. He didn't really get to cash in on that, despite the fact that the movie, it won an Oscar. It won an Oscar for best special effects. He didn't even go to the ceremony. Dan O'Bannon didn't go to the Oscar ceremony. It should have made his career, but instead, once again, Hollywood just kind of ignored him. Nobody really gave him his. They thought he was a hack, I guess. I don't know. I mean, maybe someone like Walter Hill had more sway because he had more produced screenplays. And so when he said that O'Bannon was a shit writer, people believed it and didn't want to give him any more work. So it's not like he was the next hot screenwriter in Hollywood after this, like he should have been.
It's tough because, he doesn't ever help himself. It doesn't seem like, but he also deserves so much more credit than he gets. And so you can see some of the things that irritate him. Yeah.
So the next film with his name on the credits would come out 2 years after Alien. It's a film that reunited him with his Alien co-writer, Ron Shusett. And that film, which is what we're going to discuss next week for part 3 in this series, was 1981's Dead and Buried. It's a fun film. It's one that, a lot less known than Alien, and I haven't seen it in years, but I remember enjoying it. So we'll discover if that still holds the case, if that's still the case, and see if we can find some fun behind the scenes stories for you guys on that one.
There's so many more things to discuss with this film. It drives me crazy that like all of the stories that like the cat, how they got the cat to hiss. They hit a Doberman or a German Shepherd behind a wall. And so then the cat starts to come towards Harry Dean Stanton, and then they pull the wall up and it's a German Shepherd and the cat hisses and runs away. And just little stupid stories like that. I just think it's so much fun. And then the ideas that Scott had that he's going to later play out, and much to Justin's chagrin, he'll play out just about what the space jockey is and what the idea was with the carrier that the eggs are on and that whole thing. And I don't know, it feels like a whole discussion for the Alien franchise that like when I was watching the OG original commentary for the film, he's talking about, he always, from like day one, it sounds like he thought of the aliens are a weapon and they get dropped into an area and they kind of capture whatever, they integrate with whatever they're around. And so do you remember like, was it the late 80s, early 90s where there were like alien toys where you could get like the gorilla alien and the tiger alien? And like, it was just like the alien.
I mean, even in, what was it? One of the sequels had alien dogs in it, right? Was that Alien 3?
Oh, maybe that's right. Yeah. Oh, it's probably all after Alien 3. I totally forgot. It's been so long since Alien 3. We're watching through them right now, the wife and I, and Alien 3 always fits right there with Highlander 2 for me as movies. I have seen once, but started like 15 times each.
Are you watching the assembly cut?
I think I'm going to watch the assembly cut. Yeah. Cause I was doing this research earlier when I was trying to find out, like what's, cause the fucking anthology thing has, the OG and the special editions of each. So I'm like, well, which one's better? So
I would recommend the assembly cut on part 3.
Yeah. So part 3, it sounds like Fincher, he dropped out either way, but at least in the assembly cut, they just like tried to piece it together a little bit more to what he had intended. And he still doesn't claim any of it, it sounds like, but anyway, it's at least more to what he was working on at the time. And supposedly on Reddit and stuff, people say it's a more coherent story than the original.
I think it's a little bit better. It's still not great, but it's better than theatrical. I think it's time to wrap this up, fellas.
Wait episodes. A minute. Let's talk about one other thing.
Gary, we have been talking for 4 hours about this movie.
But I did want to say that Ridley Scott, by the way, he did fight the studio to get that last act in there. This movie was supposed to end. I just found this fascinating. It was supposed to end with her escaping the ship. And that's where it ended. And Ridley Scott never felt like that was the end. So he fought for what he called the 4th act, which was Ridley on the shuttle and the aliens still being there.
Yeah. Which is a great finale, honestly. He made a good decision on that part.
Yeah, I agree. And first of all, I don't know what size panties those are she's wearing, but they don't cover her ass crack. So that's point A. Point 2 is
point A and point 2.
Point 2 is I always wondered what was going on with the alien there, just like cupping up in that little hole. Like he's just
hanging out in the amongst, he's camouflaged.
He's trying to camouflage himself. He's very slow until she notices him, and he's still kind of lazy about it. Supposedly, the concept was going to be that the alien is transforming himself into an egg. Like he's going back. It's like some kind of evolutionary thing. Like it's going to be like eventually making itself into an egg. that was like a second thing to what Scott wanted to do. And Scott's original ending, he said, was that Ripley shoots the xenomorph with the grappling hook and it doesn't do anything. And the xenomorph just lunges at her and tears her head off. And then it goes to the comms and you see it fully integrating and it's typing on the computer. And then it uses Dallas's voice to say, I'm signing off or something like that at the end of the movie.
That's stupid. I'm glad they didn't do that.
But it was something like that. So anyway, I just wanted to share that just for everybody who stuck around with us. Thank you so much. I will stop talking about Alien now.
Well, all right. Well, let's call
except for this one thing. No, I'm just kidding.
Jesus Christ, Gary. Well, where can you guys be found on the internet for our listeners?
I am at This Is Gary Horne. And I also have a wrestling show if you are interested. It's at TIPW Show. This is Pro Wrestling, and we're doing a similar thing to what we're doing with the movies right now, but we're doing it with wrestling. So if you've ever been interested in pro wrestling and where it comes from, what it's all about, I think we tell the story in a very fun way. And you can listen to that at TIPW Show. You can find all the links and the bios and stuff there. We just talked about a guy named the Master Marvel. It's full of impersonations by me is what that show is, because for some reason everybody leans on me to make impersonations of the people that we're talking about. So I have to find like clever ways to discuss them. So I have to discuss about this one guy like Joe Stecker, who was a champion back in the day, but he practiced his leg scissors, which was his finisher on farm animals. So yeah. So then I get to pretend to be Joe Stecker. He sounds a lot like this. And do my leg scissors. Don't get nasty now. Justin, I don't do nothing nasty with no pigs. You know why you don't do nothing nasty with no pigs, Justin?
No, I don't.
Because they'll squeal on you. and anyway, and then my other character, we just discussed the first masked wrestler who was the Masked Marvel, and he's just pretty much like, hey, everybody, I'm here. I'm the Masked Marvel. Mask me anything. Anyway, all right, Todd, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Anyway,
I'm sorry. I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all the socials. And if you like Star Trek, I have a podcast covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order. It's called Computer Resume Podcast, and you can find that on Apple and Spotify and Google and on social media at Computer Resume.
Yeah. I'm at Justin_Bishop. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, or no, I am on Facebook, but don't send me a friend request. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and I don't want people.
He's all set. He's all set with friends, folks.
I'm good.
He's the one that I need. I mean, I'll accept your friend request. I just probably won't see it for like 4 weeks, but
but I am on Twitter and Instagram and Letterboxd. You can friend request me on all those places, and you can find the podcast at cinema_shock on Twitter, Instagram. We are also on Facebook, and we do encourage you to like us there. And you can also rate, review, share this with your friends, especially if they like Alien, apparently, because we can't stop talking about it. And until next week.
I'm just thrown back by how you big leagued everybody on Facebook. May the wings of liberty, may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
How I big leagued?
Yeah, like big leaguing them.
What does that mean?
That just means you're like big time and like you're I don't know. You know where I got the term from? If you really want to know, it's because apparently before this overly PC culture. No, this sounds like I'm like trying to be anti-woke, but supposedly this was a thing in wrestling back in the day, like Randy Orton. So it's not that far back in the day. Like Randy Orton would walk into a writer's room when new writers got hired, and he would stick his hand down the front of his tights and fondle his balls, and then like reach out to shake hands with one of the writers, like one of the new writers, like, hey, how's it going? I'm Randy Orton. And if they didn't shake his hand, he's like, what are you, like big leaguing me? You think you're too good to talk to Randy Orton?
I'm not sure how that applies to me not wanting friend requests from people I don't actually know.
I'm just saying that's where the big league term came from. I'm not saying you're like rubbing your balls to people, but if you do get lucky enough That's why he doesn't want you to add him on Facebook, because it's all like private. It's just videos of Justin rubbing his balls.
Be excellent to each other.
Jonesy has the keys.
Join Justin Bishop's OnlyFans.